Hey there, and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe you've pulled a blanket up around you, maybe there's a cup of something warm nearby. Good. Stay where you are. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Because tonight's story is one of those that works best when the world has gone quiet around you, and you can let yourself drift slowly out of the room you are in, and into a small stone chamber in France, 800 years ago, on the kind of late afternoon, when the bells have just rung for vespers, and the chanting from the abbey church is reaching the upper window as a low, steady music. Tonight we are going somewhere very specific, not just in distance, but in time. Imagine this. The year is 1204. The place is Fontevraud Abbey in the valley of the Vienne in western France. And in a quiet room in the abbey's guest quarters, an old queen is sitting by a window. She is in her 82nd year. Her hands rest on a blanket of dark wool. A small fire burns in the grate. A scribe sits at a table near her, with parchment unrolled and a quill and a small clay pot of ink. He is waiting for her to speak. Look around the chamber for a moment. The walls are whitewashed over the pale limestone of the abbey's guest quarters. The floor is flagstone. The window is narrow, a slit of grey evening set deep into the thickness of the wall. A charcoal brazier has been brought in because the queen's hands grow cold in the late afternoon. A single candle burns beside the scribe. The air smells of the candle wax and of the faint bitterness of the ink, and under those of the apples stored on shelves in the next room, where the abbey keeps the windfalls from the orchard in the autumn and turns them, over the winter, slowly into the cider that the sisters drink at supper. Outside the window, which looks east, the shadow of the abbey church is lengthening across the herb garden. The bells of the chapter house have rung for vespers. The sisters are in the choir. The chanting reaches the Queen's chamber as a low, steady music. Here is something I want you to hold for a moment. These are the same psalms that she has heard sung in every abbey of her life. In Poitiers, when she was a child. In Saint-Denis, when she was the Queen of France. In Westminster, when she was the Queen of England. In the castle chapels of her imprisonment. And now here, at the end, in the abbey where she will be buried. The music is the same. The voices change. The psalms do not. Think about that for a second. 80 years of the same chants, in different stones, in different countries, sung by different mouths. There is a particular kind of life that becomes legible only at the end of it, when you can hear the through line, the one continuous sound under all the changes. For Eleanor, that sound was the chant. For the rest of us, listening tonight, it might be something else entirely. But I think the principle is the same. We do not always know what the constant is until we have lived long enough to look back and notice. She has been dictating letters for 3 days. The letters go to abbesses in England. They go to vassals in Poitou. They go to the court of her grandson in Castile. She has outlived 2 husbands, 3 kings, 2 of her own sons, a crusade in which she rode to Jerusalem, an imprisonment that lasted 16 years, and a century that seemed, in its final years, to belong to no one but her. Tonight we are going to follow her through that whole life, from the day of her birth in Aquitaine, through 2 marriages and 2 coronations and 8 children, through the long captivity in English castles, to the late years of regency over a kingdom she had once been forbidden to enter, and at last to this quiet chamber at Fontevraud, where she sits now dictating to a scribe. The stone walls hold the heat of an April afternoon. The bees move in the garden outside. The priests chant in the abbey church below. So, get comfortable. There is no hurry tonight. We are going to take this slowly, the way she would have wanted it told, in a voice not much louder than the chanting outside her window. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to drift into sleep or to walk beside an old queen through the memory of her life, I am glad you are with me. If you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Now, the Queen closes her eyes. The scribe waits. And the window opens, for her and for us, onto a country she has not seen in a very long time. The country is Aquitaine. The year is 1122, and the life begins. Here is something I find genuinely astonishing about the world she was born into. Aquitaine in the 12th century is the richest duchy in France. Its name comes from the Latin for the land of waters, and the rivers are everywhere. The Loire runs along its northern border. The Garonne and the Dordogne run through its heart. The Adour runs down to the Pyrenees. The vineyards rise from the banks of every river, and the wine that comes from those vineyards is the best wine in Europe. I want you to picture that for a moment. Not just as a fact, but as a country. Imagine a land where every road, sooner or later, comes down to a river, and every river runs down to the sea. Imagine the long late summers of the south, the dry afternoons in the vine rows, the cool of the cellars when the wine is being drawn from the oak. Imagine the towns built up on hills above water, with stone bridges and water mills, and the sound in every season of moving water carrying down through the valleys. That is the country we are going into. That is the country she carries with her for the rest of her life, even when she is in places that have nothing of it. The Dukes of Aquitaine are the richest vassals of the King of France. They hold more land than he does. Their court is older than his court. Their poets are more famous than his. The capital of the duchy is Poitiers in the north, a walled city of churches and palaces on a hill above the River Claine. The summer capital is Bordeaux, on the Garonne. The hunting castles are scattered through the forests of the Poitou and the Limousin. And here is where the story turns, in a way that matters for everything that follows. The music of Aquitaine is the music of the troubadours. The troubadours are poets who write in the language of the south, which is called Occitan, and they sing of love. Not the chaste love of a knight for his lady in her tower, but a subtle, intricate, tormented love. Love that cannot be fulfilled. Love that raises the lover. Love that is a religion in itself, with its own vocabulary, its own rituals, its own forms of suffering. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the great inventions of European culture, and most people do not know that it was invented at all. The idea that romantic love is something noble, something that improves the lover, something worth writing poems about and building entire codes of behavior around, is not a natural and obvious idea. It is a specific cultural creation, and it was created, more than anywhere else, in the courts of Aquitaine in the early 12th century. Almost everything that came after, the love sonnets of the Renaissance, the romantic fiction of the 18th century, the love songs on the radio tonight, traces back, by one route or another, to a small group of poets writing in Occitan, in the country where Eleanor was born. The first great troubadour is the grandfather of the Queen, who will be born in 1122. His name is William IX, Duke of Aquitaine. He is a soldier, he is a crusader, he is a bigamist. And he is a poet whose songs, preserved in manuscripts for 900 years, are the first lyric poems in any modern European language. His voice is frank, sardonic, sometimes obscene, sometimes devout, always original. He writes of his horses, he writes of his mistresses, he writes of his soul. Imagine a man like that as your grandfather. The first thing you absorb, before you can read, before you can speak in full sentences, is that words can be made to dance, that the people around you take poems seriously, that the highest people in your country are people who write. That kind of childhood marks you for life. The courts of Aquitaine are ordered around this poetry. A troubadour is paid to sing at a great feast. He may travel from court to court with a jongleur, who is his performer and his musician, and the two of them together entertain a hall of lords and ladies for an evening in exchange for a fur cloak, or a silver cup, or a purse of coins, or sometimes simply a good dinner and a bed for the night. The songs are remembered, the songs are copied out, The songs travel across mountains and into Spain and north into France, until the lyric of love, born in the orchards of Aquitaine, becomes the lyric of a continent. This is the world into which Eleanor is born. The wine in the cellars, the poetry in the hall, the rivers in the valleys, the rain on the slate roofs of Poitiers. She will carry this world inside her for the rest of her life. She will carry it to Paris, to London, to Antioch, to the castles of her imprisonment, and to the church of her death. It is the first fact of her, and it is the last fact. She is a daughter of Aquitaine, and the country is in her blood. Now close your eyes for a moment. I want you to imagine a nursery in the palace at Poitiers in the spring of 1122. A woman is in labour in a large room with a great fireplace. The room has been prepared for the birth. The floors have been strewn with fresh rushes. The bed linens have been changed. A midwife has been brought from the village. Her assistant is there. The duke's confessor waits in the antechamber. The duchess is Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is in her early 20s. This is her first child. Her husband, William X, paces in the next room. His father, the old troubadour duke, is also in the house. The family has been praying for weeks for a son. A son will inherit the duchy. A daughter will have to be married off with a dowry. Sit with that for a second. The whole household is praying, in the chapel and in the kitchens and in the stables, for the child currently being born to be of one specific sex rather than the other. That is the world this child is being born into. Her welcome, in some sense, has been arranged in advance. The labour is long. It lasts most of a day and a night. Toward dawn on the second day, the child is born. The midwife lifts the infant. The child is a girl. The news travels to the next room. The duke receives it without visible disappointment, because the duke has been trained, from boyhood, to receive bad news without visible disappointment. Bread and wine are brought in. Prayers are offered. The child is named. Her name is Eleanor. In the Latin of the chanceries, it becomes Eleonora. In the English of the later centuries, it becomes Eleanor. The name means, in the old tongue, other Eleanor, because she is named for her mother, with a small distinguishing prefix. She is the eldest daughter of the house. She has, as the first months of her life go by, no particular future. A girl born to a duke will be sent, at an appropriate age, to marry another duke, or a count, or, if her father is ambitious, a prince. Her life will be her husband's life. Her name will not, in the ordinary run of things, be remembered. That is one of the things I find moving about her, looking back at her now. The name of the most powerful woman of the 12th century was at its origin a kind of footnote. Other Eleanor. The second one, the spare, the one who takes her mother's name with a small prefix added to keep them straight in the parish register. There was nothing in the manner of her birth that suggested the world would, 8 centuries later, still be repeating it. The childhood that she does not yet know she is beginning is the childhood of a great Aquitanian noble. She will be nursed by a peasant woman from the village of Lusignan. She will be raised for her first 7 years in the palace nursery, with her younger brother William Aigret, who will be born within the year, with the children of the court who are fostered at Poitiers, with the small zoo of pet dogs and birds that the Duchess maintains in her private apartments. She will be taught, as she begins to walk, to stay out of the way of the great deerhounds that sleep in the hall. She will be taught, as she begins to speak, that there are words that may be used in the hall and used in the nursery, but that the two sets are not the same. She will be taught, as she begins to read, the first letters of Latin and of the langue de doc, the letters that will remain in her hand for the next 80 years. Here, by the way, is one of the small, extraordinary facts about her. In a century when most kings could not read at all, when even the great barons signed their charters with a cross because they had not been taught to write their names, this duchess's daughter is being taught, at 4 or 5, to make out the letters of Latin in her primer. The literacy that begins in this Poitiers nursery is going to last her until the candle goes out in her chamber at Fontevraud in 1204. There is a kind of continuity in that, a single thread running through 80 years of life that is worth pausing on. The letters she learns to read at 5 are still being read, in stone on the effigy that will be carved for her tomb. The book in her hands on her tomb is the same book, in a sense, that she opened in the nursery. She will grow up among the smells of her country. The smell of the wine as it is drawn from the oak barrels in the palace cellars. The smell of the hounds after a wet day's hunting. The smell of the herb garden in summer of thyme and rosemary and marjoram and lavender. The smell of the cathedral at Poitiers on the feast of St. Hilary, of incense and of the 100 candles burning at the reredos. The smell of the horses in the palace stables. The smell, on washing days, of the sheets hanging from the ropes in the courtyard in the sun. The smell of bread from the bakehouse. The smell of the river when the wind comes up from the south. She will hear, as she grows, the songs of her country. The troubadours of her grandfather's generation are still alive in her childhood. Marquebrun, Circamon, Geoffrey, Rudel. They come to the court at Poitiers in the summer. They sing in the hall. The girl, in her small chair beside her mother, watches them. The ballads are of a knight's love for a distant lady whom he has never met. The ballads are of a pilgrim who finds in a distant shrine a peace that he could not find at home. The ballads are of a maid who goes out into the May morning and is surprised by a stranger. The songs are copied into her memory in childhood, and she will remember them and sing them herself in the long nights of her imprisonment 60 years later, because a song learned in childhood is a song that does not leave. Hold that detail in your mind. It will matter again in a different room, in a different country, 60 years from this nursery in Poitiers. We will come back to it when we get there. But the ordinary run of things is about to stop. Within a year, her mother will give her a brother, a little boy named William Aigret, who is expected to inherit everything. The family seems complete, the duchy's future seems secure. Then, in 1130, when Eleanor is 8 years old, her brother will die of a fever. His death will make her the heir, and then her mother will die. And by the time she is 15 years old, she will be the richest unmarried woman in Europe, with a duchy larger than France itself under her hand, and every ambitious man from Normandy to Rome will be trying to marry her. And that is exactly where we are going next. The death of William X comes in Santiago de Compostela, in Spain, on Good Friday, April the 9th, 1137. He has gone on pilgrimage. He has eaten tainted fish, or drunk bad water, or caught some fever along the road. The sources are unclear on the precise cause. What is clear is that he dies far from home, in a pilgrim hostel, with only his confessor beside him. There is something almost unbearably precarious about a death like that, when you stop to think about it. He is not a poor man. He is one of the great noblemen of Europe, and he dies in a hostel, hundreds of miles from his home, with only one of his servants beside him, on a pilgrim road, in a country whose language he does not speak well. That is the world Eleanor is about to inherit, by the way. A world in which the most powerful man in southwestern France can die in a hostel, and there is nothing his daughter can do about it, because the news takes weeks to travel. His will is dictated in his final hours. He leaves his duchy to his eldest daughter. He asks that she be placed under the protection of the King of France, Louis VI, who is called Louis the Fat, and whose court is in Paris. He asks that a husband be found for her from the royal house as quickly as possible. He dies. His body is buried at Compostela. The news rides north. The news reaches Bordeaux first, then Poitiers. Then, 11 days later, the king in Paris. Louis the Fat is himself a dying man. He is in his 50s. He has dropsy. His legs will not hold him. His physicians give him weeks. But he sees, in the news from Compostela, the political opportunity of a century. The Duchy of Aquitaine is larger than the royal domain. If he can marry the heiress to his own son, he can double the French crown's holdings in one stroke. He moves within a day. Think about the calculus of that for a second. A man who knows he is dying receives news of another man's death, and his first thought is not grief, not sympathy, not even policy in the abstract sense. His first thought is that his son must marry that man's daughter before anyone else can get to her. The reason is simple. In the political logic of the 12th century, an unmarried 15-year-old heiress is not a person. She is a territory with a face. Whoever marries her acquires the territory. Louis the Fat understands this with the clarity of a man on his deathbed. He moves accordingly. His son is Prince Louis, who is 16 years old, a pious and awkward boy who has been trained since childhood for the church. Louis's elder brother was the heir, but the elder brother died in a street accident 3 years earlier, thrown from his horse after the animal tripped over a pig, and Louis has been called away from his studies to become the future king. He is not prepared. He does not want the crown. He wants in his heart to be a monk. His father has not consulted his heart. The wedding party is assembled in a week. A body of 500 knights rides south from Paris. The prince travels with them. They go down through Orleans, through Tours, through Poitiers, and on to Bordeaux, a journey of nearly a month in the summer heat. The prince is 16. He has never been south of the Loire. The country he is crossing is foreign to him in a way that is hard to overstate. The language is not French. The clothing is not French. The food is not French. He is entering a country that, in the geography of French politics, is only nominally French at all. I want you to picture him for a moment, that boy on horseback, riding south through July, through a country where he understands almost nothing. The road is dusty. The summer is hot in a way. The Ile-de-France summers are not hot. The wine at the inns is too strong for him. The food is full of garlic and herbs he has never tasted. The men at the wayside cheer him in a language he does not speak. Every mile takes him further from the only world he has ever known, toward a wedding that has been arranged for him by men he does not know, to a girl he has never met. He is 16. Eleanor is 15. She is waiting for him in Bordeaux. She has been told that the marriage is decided. She has not been asked whether she wants it. Her father has bound her on his deathbed to the King of France, and has sent his son, and the son is on his way, and the duchy of Aquitaine will be joined, by the sacrament of her marriage, to the crown of France. She is dressed in silk. Her hair is uncovered, because she is not yet married. She is, in the portraits that have been made of her at this age, and in the descriptions that have come down through the chronicles, extraordinarily beautiful. Now ask yourself something. What does a 15-year-old girl think in the days before a wedding she has not chosen? The historical record does not tell us. Eleanor never wrote a memoir. She left no diary. The chroniclers who wrote about her in the later years, when she had become a controversial figure, were not interested in her interior life as a 15-year-old. So we have to imagine, and what we can imagine is something like this. A girl who has in the past 2 months become an orphan, become the richest unmarried woman in Europe, and become engaged, all without being asked. A girl whose loyal household is now packing her trunks for a journey north she does not particularly want to make. A girl who has been told, kindly enough, by her advisors that this is the best possible outcome and that she should be grateful, and who, like a great many 15-year-olds before and since, knows perfectly well that the absence of choice and the presence of advisors are not the same thing as her own consent. The wedding takes place in the Cathedral of Bordeaux on the 25th of July, 1137. The Archbishop presides. Eleanor and Louis exchange vows in a church crowded with nobles from both sides of the Loire. A banquet follows. The bride wears a crimson overgown of silk, the colour of power. The groom wears a robe of cloth of gold. The feast lasts for most of the day. The wedding night is not recorded. The history of what happens between Eleanor and Louis in the darkness of their first chamber is something the chronicles, out of custom and respect, do not describe. We know only that Louis is nervous, that Eleanor is 15, that both of them are entering a partnership they did not choose, and that the marriage, from this moment forward is the fact around which the rest of their lives will arrange themselves. A week later, the news comes from Paris. Louis the Fat is dead. The dropsy has taken him. The boy on the banquet bench in Bordeaux is now the King of France. He is Louis VII. His wife is Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Consort of the Franks, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Countess of Poitou, the richest woman in Western Europe. She is 15 years and a handful of months old. Let that number sit for a moment. 15. We are talking about a girl who, by modern standards, would be in the second year of secondary school. And she has just become, by marriage and by inheritance, the owner of a territory roughly the size of modern Belgium and the queen consort of a kingdom that is, on paper, larger than that. Again, she has been a wife for 8 days. She has been an orphan for 3 months. She has not yet seen the country she is now expected to live in for the rest of her life. The new king and the new queen ride north together. They go up the long road from Bordeaux to Paris. The procession takes 6 weeks. At every town they pass, the bells are rung. At every abbey, the monks come out to bless them. Eleanor rides in the summer heat, in a litter when she is tired, on a horse when she is strong. She is watching the country, she is leaving. She is learning the country, she is entering. She is understanding, with every mile, that the world she grew up in is behind her, and that the world ahead of her is something she will have to invent. Paris in the summer of 1137 is not yet the Paris of the cathedrals and the university. Those are still to come. It is a smaller city, built on an island in the Seine, with a stone wall around it and a royal palace at the western end of the island and a cathedral at the eastern end, that is still the old Romanesque church that Notre Dame will replace. The streets are narrow, the houses are wooden, the smell is of the river and of the tanneries and of the bakers who work through the night. I want you to compare the two cities for a moment, because the comparison is one of the things that shaped Eleanor's life. Bordeaux, where she has just been married, is a city of stone and sun and wine, looking out toward the Atlantic, with its trade running south to Spain and east to the Mediterranean. Paris, where she is going, is a wooden city on a damp river island, looking inward, with its trade running mainly to itself. Bordeaux speaks Occitan. Paris speaks the langue d'oil, the northern French that will eventually become the modern language. The food is different, the architecture is different, the light is different, even the weather is different. Eleanor has gone, in the space of 6 weeks, from the warm south to the wet north, from a country whose poets are famous to a country whose clerics are famous, from a place where a duchess was, in some sense, the highest authority to a place where the highest authority is the church. Eleanor arrives in the autumn rain. The court comes out to meet her. The Queen Mother, Adelaide of Maurienne, a devout Savoyard woman who has not been consulted on the wedding, examines her new daughter-in-law and is not, by the reports of those present, pleased with what she sees. The court of Louis VII is not the court of Aquitaine. The first thing Eleanor notices, in her first weeks on the Ile de la Cite, is that no one sings. There is no troubadour at the king's table. There is no jongleur in the hall. The entertainment at a French banquet is the conversation of clerics and the reciting of psalms. The ladies of the court wear grey and brown. They do not wear the vivid silks of Bordeaux. They do not speak in the hall unless they are spoken to. The king himself eats little, drinks water, prays before and after every meal, and retires early to his chamber. Sit with that for a moment. Imagine being 15 and arriving at a place like that. The hall is silent except for the murmur of clerics. The other women do not look at you. Your husband, who is supposed to be the new centre of your life, does not seem to know how to be alone in a room with you. The food is plain, the wine is bad, there is no music, and in the corner of the hall, a tall, thin woman in dark clothes, who is now your mother-in-law, is watching you with an expression that you cannot quite read, but that does not look like welcome. Eleanor tries. She brings, in the carts of her trousseau, the books of her grandfather. She brings the embroidered hangings that have been stripped from the walls of Poitiers. She brings her ladies, 5 young women of the Aquitaine nobility, who speak the Languedoc and know the songs. She sets up, in her own wing of the palace, a small court within the larger court. She has the hangings hung. She has the books read aloud in the evenings. She has her ladies dance, among themselves, in the long galleries where the rain of the Ile de la Cité cannot reach them. The French court watches her with a mixture of fascination and disapproval. The Queen Mother complains to the Abbot of Saint-Denis that the new queen is vain, is frivolous, is corrupting the king. The king, for his part, is in love with her. Louis is 18 months older than Eleanor, but has the emotional weather of a boy of 14. He has been trained by monks. He has never, before this summer, been alone in a room with a woman who is not his mother. Eleanor is 15, beautiful, witty, raised in a court where women and men spoke to each other as equals in the long twilight after supper. Louis does not know what to do with her. He watches her with the expression of a novice who has been given a relic to keep in his cell and who does not know whether he is permitted to touch it. There is something genuinely sad about that image when you sit with it. 2 children, basically, in a marriage that has been arranged by their fathers. One of them prepared to live, the other prepared to pray. Each of them looking at the other across a gap that neither of them quite has the language to cross. And the political weight of half of France resting on whether these 2 teenagers can manage to make a baby together. The first pregnancy does not come quickly. A year passes, 2 years, 3. The Abbot of Saint-Denis, a shrewd and political man named Suger, who had been advisor to Louis the Fat and is now the chief minister of Louis VII, notes the absence of an heir and begins, without saying anything, to wonder. Eleanor herself, who has grown up among the frank conversations of the Poitevin court, is aware that something is wrong. Louis comes to her bed, but bed as a penitent, goes to a chapel. The visits are brief. The physical marriage is, the chroniclers later agree, at best intermittent, and at worst effectively non-existent, for long stretches. She is a queen, and she has no child. She is a duchess, and she is far from her duchy. She is 15, then 16, then 17, then 20. In a court whose language she speaks with an accent, whose customs she finds cold, whose religion she finds joyless. She does her duty. She attends the feasts of the church. She sits beside the king at the great councils. She signs the charters that come to her for her signature as Duchess of Aquitaine. She keeps her ladies. She reads her books. She waits. The daily round of the royal palace on the Ile de la Cité is not, in most respects, a luxurious one. The king rises before dawn. He hears mass in the chapel. He breaks his fast on bread and ale and a little fish. He works through the morning with Abbot Suger and the Chancellor, receiving petitioners, signing documents, hearing cases. The midday dinner is the main meal of the day, served in the great hall, with the king seated on a dais and the court ranked below him at long trestle tables. The food is plain by Aquitanian standards, which is a complaint the Poitevin ladies make constantly and quietly to one another. There is beef, there is mutton, there is salt cod, there is the thick peas porridge that the French north lives on through the long winters. The wine is local and not particularly good. The palace itself is a building of the old Frankish kings, extended and adapted over generations. The floors are flagged with stone in some rooms and strewn with rushes in others, the rushes being replaced on the rare occasions when the steward notices they have gone sour. The walls are plastered over the stonework and painted in the great rooms with scenes from the Old Testament and the lives of the kings of France. The glass in the windows is the thick greenish glass of the period, which admits light but does not permit a view. The fires, even in summer, are kept banked in the royal chambers because the building is damp and the river fog rises off the Seine every evening. Below the palace, along the quays, the working city does its work. The boats unload wine from Burgundy and grain from Picardy. The fishmongers sell eels and carp from the river. The women of the Quartier Saint-Jacques carry their washing down the stone steps to the edge of the water and beat it against the stones. their voices carrying up to the royal windows on still afternoons. The poor of the city eat bread and onions and an occasional piece of bacon at festivals. The middle sort, the merchants and the notaries, eat a mutton stew on feast days and a soup of cabbage and barley on ordinary ones. The rich, of whom there are few in Paris in these years, eat much as the court eats, though with even less variety. Eleanor tries to improve the table. She sends to the Aquitaine for the spices that the merchants of Bordeaux bring in from the south, pepper and cinnamon and ginger and saffron. She has her own cook brought up from Poitiers, a man whose work she has known since childhood. She introduces, to the astonishment of the northern kitchen, the use of olive oil in certain dishes. She has figs and almonds and citrons sent up in barrels. The northern court eats the food with suspicion. Louis, whose stomach is easily upset, eats almost none of it. The Queen Mother pointedly takes only bread and water at the feasts where the new dishes are served. The Queen of France has brought the tastes of the South into the kitchen of the royal palace, and royal palace has not, in any significant way, been persuaded. I find that detail somehow representative of the whole marriage. She is bringing the South into the North, and the North is politely declining to accept it. Not by argument, not by edict, just by 1,000 small refusals. The figs go uneaten, the olive oil is set aside. The northern tongue does not, in the end, learn to want what the southern queen has brought. Years pass like this. 3, 5, 7. Eleanor is in her early 20s now. She has produced, at last, a daughter, Marie, born around 1145. She has produced, in the 8 years of her marriage, exactly one child. Her position is precarious. Without a son, she is in dynastic terms a failure. Without a son, every ambitious cleric in the French church will sooner or later begin to whisper that the marriage is cursed. And Eleanor, who is not stupid, can hear the whispering already. The Second Crusade is preached in 1146 by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of the century, a man whose voice carries an authority that no pope and no king can equal. The city of Edessa, the eastern bulwark of the Crusader kingdoms, founded 50 years earlier, has fallen to the Turks. Jerusalem is threatened. The call goes out for a new expedition to the Holy Land, a great army to cross the Mediterranean and save what the First Crusade had won. Now, I want you to understand what a crusade meant in the 12th century, because we have inherited the word and lost most of the weight of it. A crusade was the largest collective enterprise the medieval West was capable of organizing. It pulled men out of every corner of Europe, knights and clerics and tradesmen and pilgrims, and sent them on a journey of 3,000 miles, across mountains, across deserts, into countries whose languages they did not speak, and whose climates would kill many of them, in the name of a religious idea so compelling that it overrode every personal calculation. People sold their estates to go. They left their wives and children for years at a time. They died in their thousands of disease, of thirst, of arrows, in passes they had never heard the names of. They went anyway. The First Crusade had succeeded against the odds. The second was being organized in the conviction that it would do so again. Louis VII takes the cross. He takes it partly out of piety, partly because he has been tormented for years by a massacre of civilians in a church at Vitry that his own soldiers committed during a minor war, and he believes a crusade will cleanse his conscience. Eleanor takes the cross beside him. She is 24. She has been queen for 10 years. She has produced, at last, one daughter, named Marie, who is safely in a nursery at Paris. She has never travelled beyond the borders of France. She is offered, by the call of the crusade, the chance to ride east across half the known world, to see the cities of Constantinople and Antioch and Jerusalem. To do what her grandfather William IX had done half a century before her when he went on the First Crusade and came home to write poems about it. She goes, not as a wife trailing her husband, but as Duchess of Aquitaine, bringing her own vassals and her own money. 300 Poitevin knights ride with her, under her own banner. Her ladies come with her. She equips her own contingent from her own treasury. The chroniclers, almost all of them northern clerics who disapprove of her, make much of the detail that she and her ladies appear. At the departure, dressed in some form of military costume, possibly mounted on white horses, possibly bearing lances. The details are exaggerated. The underlying fact is accurate. Eleanor rides to the Second Crusade as a sovereign in her own right. She is not an accessory to her husband's piety. She is a queen at the head of her own men. Hold that picture for a moment. A queen of France, 24 years old, riding out at the head of 300 knights of her own house on a journey to Jerusalem. There is no one quite like her in the history of the period. Other queens travel with their husbands. Other queens send vassals. No other queen rides east as the head of her own contingent, on her own banner, with her own treasury. It is the first time we see, clearly and unmistakably, what kind of woman she is going to turn out to be. And it is one of the reasons the chroniclers of Paris will never quite forgive her. The army leaves France in the early summer of 1147. It crosses Germany. It reaches Constantinople in October. The Byzantine emperor, Manuel Comnenus, receives them with elaborate courtesy and watches them with elaborate suspicion. He feeds them. He entertains them. He ferries them in small groups across the Bosphorus to Anatolia, which he wishes them to leave as soon as possible. The army crosses into Asia. The disasters begin almost at once. Constantinople itself is for Eleanor and for the whole French court the great shock of the journey. It is not merely that the city is larger than Paris. It is larger than every city in Western Europe put together. Its walls run for 14 miles. Its population is perhaps 500,000, perhaps more, when no Western city has as many as 40,000. The great church of Hagia Sophia, which has been standing for 6 centuries by the time the French see it, is a dome so large that the architects of Paris and of Cologne have no conceptual category for how it was built. The streets are paved in marble, the palaces have running water, the imperial court wears silks embroidered with gold and mounted with pearls. Everyone in it speaks Greek. A few, for the benefit of the visitors, speak Latin. A handful speak the particular court French of the Norman kingdoms of the south, because the emperor has employed Norman mercenaries and has sent envoys to their courts. The French crusaders, at their feasts in the imperial hall, eat from silver plates off tables of lemonwood. They drink wines they have never tasted before. They are offered, by the emperor's chamberlain, fruits preserved in honey from the far end of the world. Try to imagine the shock of it for a second. You have grown up thinking that Paris is a great city. You have grown up assuming that your civilization, the Christian civilization of the Latin West, is the most advanced in the world. And then, in a single week of October, you arrive at a place whose walls alone are longer than the entire road system of your home country. A place where a single church is taller than every cathedral you have ever seen. A place where the streets are paved with marble and the fountains run with clean water. A place that has been doing this more or less continuously for 7 centuries, while your ancestors were still living in wooden halls. The world is very much larger and very much older than you thought. That is the lesson of Constantinople, and Eleanor learns it in a way she will not forget. Eleanor is 25. She has been, until this autumn, a woman who had never seen a city larger than Paris, which has perhaps 50,000 people, and which she considered, when she first entered it, a remarkable metropolis. She walks through Hagia Sophia with her husband and her Poitevin ladies on a day in October when the dome is struck by sunlight that comes through the clerestory windows in long slanted shafts and falls onto the mosaic floor in pools of gold. She stands under the dome and looks up. The chroniclers do not record what she said. They record only that she was in Constantinople for 3 weeks, and that she saw, in those 3 weeks, a quantity of wealth and an ambition of architecture that changed, permanently, what she understood the world could contain. The crossing to Asia is made in small Byzantine transports, oar-powered, ferrying a few hundred men at a time. The horses swim alongside the boats, tethered to the gunwales. The water is cold. The wind comes down the strait from the Black Sea. The emperor's officers hurry the Frenchmen aboard. They count the transports. They ferry the army across in a matter of days, and then, pointedly, withdraw their boats so that no crusader can easily return. The army camps on the eastern shore and looks east, toward the mountains of Bithynia, and beyond them the plateau of Anatolia, and beyond that 600 miles away, the coast of the Mediterranean at Antioch. The march across the Anatolian plateau in the winter of 1147 and 1148 is a catastrophe. The Turks pick off the army in ambushes. The supply trains are lost. Horses die of cold and hunger. Men desert. The weather is terrible. A chronicler named Odo of Duol, who is with the expedition as Louis's chaplain, records the sufferings in a diary that survives, and that is the principal eyewitness account of what Eleanor herself endured. Odo does not like her. He disapproves of her ladies, her southerners, her worldliness. But he cannot deny that she suffered what the army suffered. She slept on the ground, she ate what the soldiers ate, she crossed the passes in the same freezing rain that broke lesser men. I want you to hold that for a moment, because it is one of the things I find most striking about her. The chroniclers who have devoted their lives to writing her down cannot, when it comes to the actual physical test of the crusade, find any honest way to dismiss her. She slept on the ground, she ate the soldiers' food, she crossed the passes. Whatever else she was not soft. The pampered queen, the chronicles wanted her to be, is not the queen who actually made it across Anatolia in the winter of 1147. The queen who actually made it across Anatolia was tougher than most of her men. The specific disaster of the march is a battle at Mount Cadmus in January of 1148, in which the Turks ambush the vanguard of the army as it crosses a narrow pass. The vanguard, which contains Eleanor and her household, makes the error of pressing ahead through the pass, instead of waiting to establish camp on the far side, as Louis had ordered. When the Turks attack, the rearguard, which is under Louis's personal command, is too far behind to assist. The vanguard is cut to pieces. Louis himself escapes only by climbing a tree and not coming down until nightfall. He spends the night in the tree. In the morning, he finds that a third of his army has been killed or scattered. He lays the blame, publicly, on the commander of the vanguard, Eleanor's own Poitevin vassal Geoffrey de Rancon. In private, he lays it on Eleanor. Her presence on the crusade, he has begun to believe, has been an affliction on the army from the beginning. That night in the tree is one of the small dark comedies of medieval history. The King of France, the leader of a great crusade, the eldest son of the kings of the Franks, spending an entire winter night in a tree because he has nowhere else to go. And in the morning, when he climbs down, the political consequences of his marriage are something he cannot forgive. It is a strange thing about humiliation. People rarely blame themselves for it. They blame whoever is closest. Louis was not particularly cruel. He was simply a man who had spent a night in a tree, and his wife was the obvious explanation. The army reaches Antioch in the spring of 1148. Antioch is the great Crusader city of northern Syria, ruled by Raymond of Poitiers, who is Eleanor's own uncle, her father's younger brother. Raymond is a tall, handsome, charming man of 40, who has been in the Holy Land for a dozen years, and who has built Antioch into the most sophisticated of the Crusader courts. He speaks the Languedoc, he has a library, he has gardens. He welcomes Eleanor as a beloved niece returned to him from the far side of the world. He welcomes Louis with somewhat less warmth. He is hoping, desperately, that the crusade will march east against the Turks of Aleppo, who are the immediate threat to his principality. Louis wishes to march south to Jerusalem, which is his personal object of pilgrimage. Try to feel what Antioch was for Eleanor. She has been, for almost a year, marching. She has been cold, hungry, frightened, far from anyone who shared her language. She has watched her own knights die in passes whose names she cannot pronounce. She has slept on the ground, eaten with soldiers, washed in cold streams. And she rides, at the end of all this, into a sophisticated palace on the Syrian coast, where the gardens are full of fountains, and the library has books in her own language, and the host is her uncle, a man she has not seen since she was a child, but who remembers her father, who remembers her grandfather, who knows the songs she grew up listening to. After a year of cold and disaster, she has come home to a country she has never visited. That is what Antioch was, and it explains, more than anything else, what happens next. The dispute becomes bitter. Eleanor sides with her uncle, partly because his plan is the strategically sound one, partly because she has found in him, after 10 years in the cold court of Paris, a man she can talk to in her own language about the things that matter to her. They spend long hours together in the palace at Antioch. They speak, almost certainly, of the Aquitaine. They speak of poetry. They speak of the political situation. And the chroniclers, watching from Louis's side, begin to whisper that the long hours are something else. The rumour of an affair between Eleanor and her uncle Raymond is born in Antioch in the spring of 1148. The rumour is probably not true. It is, however, recorded, and once recorded, it becomes part of the story. I want to be careful here, because this is one of the points where the legend has overgrown the evidence. The chroniclers who reported the rumour were Louis's chaplains. They had every reason to want Eleanor to look bad, because Louis had every reason to want grounds for an annulment. The rumour served a political purpose. That does not mean it was invented from nothing, but it does mean we should be cautious about repeating it as fact. What we know for certain is that Eleanor, after 10 years of a marriage that had given her one daughter and very little else, found herself in a place where, for the first time in a decade, she could be openly herself. That is the actual scandal of Antioch. Not what she did with her uncle, which we cannot prove and probably did not happen, but the simple fact that she was visibly happier in his company than she had ever been in her husband's. That was, in 12th century terms, sufficient cause for whispering. What is certainly true is that Eleanor, in Antioch, speaks to Louis for the first time of a divorce. She raises the question of consanguinity. She and Louis are, it turns out, distantly related, through common descent from an 11th century ancestor. A canon lawyer could argue that their marriage is uncanonical. If the Pope were to declare it so, the marriage could be dissolved. Eleanor raises this possibility to Louis. Louis is shocked. He refuses to hear of it. He has her removed from Antioch by force, if the chronicles are to be believed, and the army rides south toward Jerusalem, with Eleanor effectively a prisoner of her husband's retinue. The rest of the crusade is a disaster. The attempt on Damascus in 1148 fails after 4 days. The army withdraws in disgrace. Louis and Eleanor spend the winter in Jerusalem in a coldness that the chroniclers describe as almost unspeakable. They return to France in 1149 by separate ships. Eleanor's ship is seized, briefly, by a Byzantine fleet and then rescued by a Norman one. She lands in Palermo. She is received by the King of Sicily. She travels overland up through Italy. She and Louis meet, eventually in Rome, where the Pope hears their complaint, refuses to grant an annulment, and encourages them, with all the weight of the Holy See, to reconcile and produce an heir. They try. They produce a second daughter named Alix, born in 1150. They do not produce a son. The marriage is finished, and both of them know it. Eleanor is 28. She has been married to Louis for 13 years. She has given him 2 daughters and no son. The French council, through the spring of 1152, debates the question of what to do, and in March of 1152, the council, with Louis's reluctant agreement, rules that the marriage is consanguineous and invalid. The annulment is pronounced at Beaugency on the 21st of March, 1152. Eleanor rides south. She is free for about a week. The journey from Beaugency to Poitiers takes her through the country she has not ruled in 14 years. She stops at every town. She is cheered. She is also, within weeks of the annulment, the object of 2 separate kidnapping attempts by ambitious noblemen who wish to marry her, by force if necessary, in order to acquire the Aquitaine. She eludes them. She reaches Poitiers. She sends a message north. I want to pause on those kidnapping attempts for a moment, because they tell you something genuinely shocking about what it meant to be, in the 12th century, a woman of sovereign wealth who was not attached to a husband. We tend to think of the medieval world in terms of the chivalric code, the knight on the white horse, defending the lady's honour, and so forth. The reality is closer to the opposite. A woman like Eleanor, riding through her own duchy on the road home, was understood, by the legal and political logic of her century, as a prize. Whoever could catch her could marry her. The chivalric romances were a kind of cultural overlay on a much harder underlying truth, and we are about to see that truth in action. The first attempt is made by Theobald, Count of Blois, who attempts to waylay her party at Blois on her southward journey. A local informant, loyal to Eleanor's household, warns her in the middle of the night. She crosses the Loire under cover of darkness, by a small ferry at a place she has arranged to be waiting for her, and she is in Tours by dawn. The second attempt is made by Geoffrey, the younger brother of Henry Plantagenet himself, who hopes to marry her and thereby preempt his brother. Geoffrey sets an ambush at the River Creuse. Eleanor, informed by scouts, detours around it and reaches Poitiers by a back road. Both episodes, which are recorded in contemporary chronicles, make it clear that a woman travelling with her own treasure through her own duchy was, in the legal and practical understanding of her century, a target. If she did not have both her wits and her loyal retainers about her, she would find herself married, against her will, to whoever caught her first. Hold the picture in your mind. A woman of 30, riding south through her own country, having to ride at night by back roads and unmarked ferries because two separate men are trying to ambush her with the explicit goal of forcing her into marriage. Within 7 days of her annulment, by two ambitious nobles she has had no previous quarrel with, the wits and the loyal retainers were not optional extras. They were the difference between Eleanor, as we know her, and Eleanor as the wife of a Count of Blois, whose history would not have been written. The message goes to a young man of 18, the son of the Count of Anjou, who has met her once at the French court the previous summer and who has, it appears, made an impression on her. The young man is named Henry. He is called Henry Plantagenet, for the sprig of broom, the Plantagenista, that his father has worn in his helmet. He is Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and heir, through his mother, to the throne of England, which is being contested between his mother, the Empress Matilda, and her cousin Stephen. Henry is shrewd, energetic, ambitious, physically restless, impatient, intellectually sharp. He is 11 years younger than Eleanor. He is, by every measure, the most promising young prince in Western Europe. She has chosen well. And here is something I want you to notice about how she has chosen. Eleanor, at 30, has just exited a marriage in which she had no say. She has fled 2 kidnapping attempts. She has every reason, in her position, to be cautious, to consult her advisors, to weigh the political alternatives over months. Instead, within days of reaching Poitiers, she sends a message. She picks the man. She proposes the marriage. She acts. The reactivity of 15 has been replaced, somewhere along the road, by the agency of 30. The girl who was married to a king she had never met has become the woman who picks her own husband by messenger from her own palace. The change in her is the size of 15 years and 1 crusade, and I think it shows. Eleanor proposes marriage. Henry accepts. They meet at Poitiers. They are married in the Cathedral of Poitiers on the 18th of May, 1152, 8 weeks after Eleanor's annulment from the King of France. The marriage is, by the standards of the age, scandalous. It is conducted without the permission of either Louis VII, who is Eleanor's feudal overlord for the Aquitaine, and whose permission is required for the remarriage of his former queen, or the Pope, who is Henry's ecclesiastical overlord for the Angevin lands. It joins the Aquitaine to Normandy to Anjou, to the claim on England. It creates, in a single ceremony, the largest land empire in Western Europe outside the Holy Roman Empire itself. It is, from the point of view of Louis VII, a personal humiliation and a political catastrophe. The wedding itself is hurried. There is no time for the elaborate preparations of a royal wedding. The cathedral is adorned with such hangings as can be found in Eleanor's own wardrobe. The guests are limited to the immediate households of the bride and groom. The bride wears a gown of dark blue silk with a circlet of gold on her uncovered hair, because she is a bride, and not yet, by the strict letter of the ceremony, a wife. The groom wears a tunic and mantle of scarlet. The Bishop of Poitiers performs the ceremony. The feast afterwards in the palace hall is modest by any standard. A notary, hastily engaged, draws up the marriage contract in the middle of the banquet because the contract must be signed before the marriage can be legally complete. Eleanor signs first, with the stylus of her own chancery. Henry signs second. The rings are exchanged. The wedding night is spent in the palace of the Dukes of Aquitaine, in the chamber where Eleanor's grandfather, the troubadour, had died 35 years earlier, and where she had been born 30, her own sons will be conceived, and born in the years to come. I find that detail extraordinary. 3 generations of the same family in the same room. There is a continuity in that which feels almost archaic to a modern reader. Most of us have not slept in a room our grandparents slept in, let alone a room they died in. But Eleanor's whole sense of place was built on this kind of continuity. The land is the family is the land. The room is not just a room. It is the place where the line of the Dukes of Aquitaine has in a sense been physically deposited for a century. And on her wedding night to Henry, she is reclaiming it. She is saying, in effect, the line goes on. Through me. In this room, Louis goes to war almost immediately. He invades Normandy. Henry defeats him. He invades again. Henry defeats him again. By the summer of 1153, Louis has accepted, in a treaty, that the new arrangement will stand. He cannot dislodge Henry. He cannot recover Eleanor. He cannot undo what has been done. He returns to Paris, where he will marry twice more, will produce the male heir he needs with his third wife, and will spend the rest of his reign looking nervously southward at what his former wife is doing. What she is doing through the years 1152 and 1153 is consolidating the Aquitaine under her own authority and her new husband's. She gives Henry her first son by him, William, in August 1153. She gives him a second, Henry the young king, in February 1155. She will give him, altogether, 5 sons and 3 daughters, a productivity that confirms, in the most public possible way, what had been privately suspected for years, namely, that the barrenness of her marriage to Louis had not been her fault. I want to underline that, because it is one of the quiet vindications of her life. For 13 years, she had been the queen who could not give the King of France a son. Every cleric in northern France had quietly assumed, as clerics will, that the failure was hers. And then, the moment she leaves that marriage, she begins producing children at the rate of nearly 1 a year. 5 sons, 3 daughters, 8 pregnancies in 13 years, every one of them carried to term, surviving infancy. The barrenness, it turns out, had a name, and the name was Louis. But by the time the truth becomes obvious, Louis is on his 3rd wife, and Eleanor is the Queen of England, and the only people who really need to know are the chroniclers, who quietly stop bringing it up. In October of 1154, Stephen of England dies at Dover. The long civil war between Stephen and Matilda, the 19 years of what the English chroniclers call the Anarchy, is over. Henry Plantagenet, who has been the heir under the Treaty of 1153, is king. He and Eleanor cross the Channel in a winter storm, They land at Southampton. They ride to London. They are crowned, side by side, in Westminster Abbey on the 19th of December, 1154. Eleanor is now queen of two countries. She wears the coronation crown of the Duchess of Aquitaine at Christmas and the coronation crown of the Queen of England at Easter. Her lands, added to Henry's, stretch from the Tweed in the north of England to the Pyrenees in the south of Gascony, a territory in which a traveller might ride for 8 weeks without leaving her jurisdiction. The empire is called, by later historians, the Angevin Empire. No one at the time uses the phrase. They understand, however, what has happened. A new power has been assembled in the West, and the power will shape the politics of Christendom for the next 40 years. Stop and think about that scale for a moment, from the Tweed to the Pyrenees. 8 weeks of riding without leaving her jurisdiction. We are talking about a territory larger than modern France and the United Kingdom combined. And it has all been assembled in the space of 2 years through one annulment, one marriage, and one death of a king. Eleanor at 32 presides, with her husband, over more land than any other ruler in Western Europe. She has, in some real sense, become the most powerful woman in the world. Henry is 21 when he is crowned. He is not the kind of king anyone in England has ever seen. He does not sit still. He does not like ceremony. He is impatient with formal audiences. He rides from one end of his kingdom to the other on horseback, travelling with a small retinue at extraordinary speeds. He appears without warning, in a town that had not expected him until the following week. He holds court in whatever hall is nearest, settling disputes by the decisive force of his own judgment. He works, by the accounts of those around him, 16 hours a day. He eats on his feet. He reads dispatches while he is being dressed. He speaks 4 languages. He has, by all accounts, a temper that can blacken a room in seconds, and a charm that can restore it in seconds more. You can imagine what it must have been like to be married to him. Exhilarating, exhausting, and probably, at least for the first 10 years, a deeply effective working partnership. Eleanor was 11 years older. She had been a queen for almost half her life. She knew how courts worked. She knew how to manage a household of clerics, how to make a foreign court accept her, how to listen to a petitioner for an hour and remember, 3 months later, what they had said. Henry brought the energy and the ambition. She brought the experience and the diplomatic patience. Together, they were one of the most formidable political marriages in medieval history. Eleanor runs the courts he cannot be in. She holds the royal household together while he rides. In the first 10 years of the marriage, she crosses the Channel at least 6 times. She gives him, in those 10 years, 7 children. William, born in 1153, who dies at 3. Henry the young king, born in 1155. Matilda, in 1156. Richard, who will be Richard the Lionheart, in 1157. Geoffrey, in 1158. Eleanor, in 1161. Joanna, in 1165. And, in 1166, at the age of 44, a last son, whom they named John. The 8 surviving children are the material of the dynasty that will reign over England for more than 250 years. 44. Pause on that number. She gives birth to her last child at 44. In a century when most women are dead by then, she has been pregnant or recovering from pregnancy for most of the previous 13 years. And she has been, simultaneously, governing an empire that stretches from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Whatever else you might say about her, she did not lack for stamina. The royal births take place, as a rule, in whichever castle Eleanor happens to be in when her time comes, which is sometimes Winchester, sometimes Westminster, sometimes Oxford or Angers or Rouen or Bordeaux. Richard is born in the royal palace at Beaumont, just outside Oxford, in September 1157. Joanna is born at Angers in the autumn of 1165. The practical arrangements of a royal birth in the 12th century are not elaborate. A chamber is prepared, a midwife is brought in, sometimes a local woman, sometimes one who has attended the queen before and who travels with the household. The royal physicians are consulted on matters of diet during the pregnancy, but are not, by the custom of the age, present at the delivery itself, which is a woman's matter. The king is informed when it is over. The bells of the nearest churches are rung. The bonfires are lit in the streets. Messengers ride out with the news, to Rome, to the French court, to the bishops of the realm, to the abbesses of the great religious houses. Eleanor each time rests for a few weeks, and then rises and resumes her work. The babies themselves are not raised by her in the modern sense. Each child is given to a wet nurse at birth. The wet nurse is usually a peasant woman whose own child has just died, or who has been hired to dry up her own milk and transfer her nursing to the royal infant. The child lives with the wet nurse and a small household of nursery attendants in a separate wing of whichever castle the royal nursery is established in. The queen visits. The queen does not, as a rule, sleep in the same room with her babies. This is the custom of every noble house in Europe, and is not a mark of special coldness on Eleanor's part. When the child is 2 or 3, the wet nurse is released, often with a pension or a small property, and the child is given a governess or a tutor. When the child is 7, the child is sent to be raised in another noble household, a practice called fostering. This is considered essential to the training of an aristocratic child, and it separates, inevitably, and sometimes painfully, the parents from their children for the greater part of their childhoods. I want to flag this, because it matters for what comes later. The relationship between Eleanor and her grown sons, which becomes one of the great dramas of her life, has to be understood against the background of medieval child-rearing. She did not raise them at her knee. She did not tuck them in at night. She visited the nursery. She presided at their christenings and their formal occasions. She planned their educations. She chose their tutors and their fosterers. But the day-to-day work of bringing them up was done by other people. By their wet nurses, by their governesses, by the foster households where they lived from age 7 onwards. This is not because she was cold. It is because the entire aristocracy of Europe lived this way. The intimate, hands-on parenting we now think of as normal is essentially a 19th century invention. In the 12th century, a great noblewoman saw her children, on average, perhaps a few hours a day in their early years, and then much less than that once they were fostered out. The bonds that formed between Eleanor and her sons were real, but they were forged largely in the brief, intense periods of contact, rather than in the slow accumulation of daily routine. That has consequences. We will see them. The court moves constantly. Henry is, for the whole of his reign, a king on horseback, and the court follows him. A royal progress looks, to the people of the towns it passes through, like the arrival of a small army, because it effectively is a small army, with its household troops and its chancery officials, and its kitchen staff, and its wagons of plate and linen and documents. A royal progress eats through the stores of any hall that receives it in 3 days. A royal progress requires a dozen fresh horses a week. Eleanor, who is with the court for most of these years, rides in a covered litter slung between 2 horses when she is pregnant, on horseback when she is not. She learns the great houses of England and Normandy and Anjou, with the specific knowledge of a woman who has spent a night in every one of them. She knows which chambers are warm in winter and which are draughty, which halls have a good cook and which do not, which castellan is to be trusted with a cipher and which is merely courteous. She learns, too, the roads. The roads of 12th century England are largely the old Roman roads, still paved in stretches, still navigable by a royal retinue, though not by heavy wagons. The roads of Normandy are packed dirt and gravel, good in dry weather, impassable in wet. The roads through the Loire Valley, the roads Eleanor has known since childhood, are the best in the empire, because the Duchy of Anjou has kept them up. A king who can move quickly can govern. A king who cannot is at the mercy of his provincial officers. Eleanor and Henry, between them, develop the habit of speed that becomes the distinguishing mark of their reign. They appear, they see, they judge, they are gone. The barons of their enormous empire never know, in any given week, whether the king or the queen may not be riding up their drive by sundown. Imagine, for a moment, what that meant for the people they governed. You are a baron in some remote corner of Aquitaine, or some windswept castle in Northumbria. You have your own routines, your own private arrangements with your tenants, your own little corruptions, your own little luxuries, your own slightly tilted version of the king's justice. And then, one Tuesday evening, with no warning, with no advance party, with nothing more than a small dust cloud on the horizon and a horn in the distance, the king rides into your courtyard. With his own household, with his own justices, with, sometimes, his own queen. He sits in your hall, he eats your food, he hears the local petitioners. He looks at your accounts, he reverses your judgments where he disagrees with them. He is gone, often, by morning. That is what it meant to be governed by Henry and Eleanor. The crown was not in a fixed place 100 miles away. The crown was a thing that might, on any given day, be standing in your hall. The marriage, through these first years, works. Henry and Eleanor are not sentimental about each other, but they are partners. She understands his ambitions. He respects her political intelligence. She has her own household, her own council, her own chancery that issues charters in her own name. She acts as co-ruler in all but the formal sense. The children grow, the empire is organised, the royal progresses move. Henry conquers Ireland. He annexes Brittany through the marriage of Geoffrey. He establishes the English common law. He builds cathedrals at Canterbury and at Wells. He reforms the exchequer. He makes, in his first decade as king, perhaps more fundamental changes to the government of England than any monarch before or after him. In the English countryside, underneath the politics of the court, the century that Eleanor is helping to govern is also the century of the small transformations. The population is rising, the ploughs are being improved, the three-field system is spreading. Land that had been waste for generations is being broken in. The monasteries are founding daughter houses in the forests. The Cistercians are draining the fens of East Anglia. The towns are growing new suburbs outside their walls. The cathedral masons of Canterbury, of Lincoln, of Durham are teaching their apprentices the techniques that within a generation will produce the early English Gothic. The peasant on his strip of land does not know that his queen is Eleanor of Aquitaine, does not know any of their names in particular, may have heard the name of the king. But his life is being shaped in small and cumulative ways by the government that she and Henry are running out of the saddlebags of their couriers. The assizes come through his village. The sheriff checks the rolls. The justices in Ayr hear his neighbour's case about a stolen pig. The common law, which will in time become the common law of every English-speaking country, is being built, one village complaint at a time, through the decisions of the courts Henry has established. Eleanor's hand is on the reforms, not always visibly, but consistently. She is the one, in particular, who keeps the continental writs aligned with the English ones, because she is, after Henry himself, the only person at the court who understands both legal traditions from the inside. Here is something worth lingering on. The legal system that we now think of as the foundation of English-speaking democracy, the trial by jury, the writ of habeas corpus, the idea that a king is subject to law, the framework that will be elaborated through Magna Carta and through every subsequent constitutional development of the next 8 centuries, takes its decisive shape during the reign of Henry II. Eleanor is at his side for more than half of it. She is not an architect of the legal reforms in the sense that Henry and his ministers are, but she is the one who keeps the system running across the channel in the duchies that were hers before they were his. The common law begins, in some sense, in the partnership of these two people, and it survives into our own century because the partnership held for long enough to push the reforms through. By the late 1160s, the marriage begins to come apart. Henry has taken a mistress, a young Englishwoman named Rosamund Clifford, who is installed at the Royal Hunting Lodge at Woodstock. Her existence is not, in the early years, a secret from Eleanor, because the English kings have always had mistresses, and the Queen is expected, in the ordinary way, to ignore them. But Henry's attachment to Rosamund is more serious than a royal passing fancy. He builds for her a bower in the maze at Woodstock. He visits her openly. He is rumoured, by the gossip of the court, to have considered, at one point, repudiating Eleanor in order to marry her. The rumour is probably not accurate, but that such a rumour can be spoken at all tells us something about the state of the marriage. I want to be careful here, because Rosamund Clifford has, over the centuries, picked up a great deal of legendary debris that has very little to do with the actual woman. The famous story in which Eleanor poisons her in the maze at Woodstock is a fabrication of much later writers. The actual Rosamund was a real person, the daughter of a Welsh marcher lord, who was probably installed at Woodstock in some discreet apartments, who had some kind of romantic attachment to the king, and who died, by her own account and by the account of contemporaries, of natural causes around 1176. There was no maze, there was no bower with a labyrinth, there was no jealous queen with a goblet of poison. Those details accrue, layer by layer, in the centuries that follow, because the public liked the story and the chroniclers obliged. We will come back to the legend at the end of tonight's story, because it is one of the things that has shaped the way we remember Eleanor, even though almost none of it is true. What is true is that the marriage was visibly cooling, that Henry was visibly attached to another woman, and that Eleanor, for the first time in 17 years, had been displaced from the partnership at the centre of the empire. She was 46. She had given Henry 8 children. She had crossed the Channel for him a dozen times. She had run his courts, signed his charters, raised his sons, and she was being, by the visible logic of the court, slowly set aside. Eleanor, in 1168, leaves England for good. She returns to Poitiers. She establishes her own court in the palace of her grandfather, in the city where she was born. She is 46. Her children are being raised, at least the eldest of them, in the scattered fortresses of the Angevin Empire, or fostered in the houses of allied nobles, or sent on the long business of diplomatic marriages. She is, for the first time in her adult life, in her own country, on her own throne, answerable to no one but the husband she is quietly coming to detest. Stop and think about what that homecoming must have felt like. She has been away for 31 years. The girl who rode out of Bordeaux in 1137 in a crimson silk overgown is now a woman of 46 in the dark blue robes of an Angevin queen. The grandfather who taught her her first songs has been dead for half a century. The mother who held her on her shoulder is a vague memory, fading. The brother who would have inherited if he had lived is a small bone pile in a country grave. And the country itself, the duchy she has been the absent ruler of for 3 decades, is waiting for her, with its rivers and its troubadours and its long golden afternoons. It is the country she carried inside herself through all the years in Paris and London and Antioch and Jerusalem. And now, at last, she is coming home to it. The court at Poitiers, in the years between 1168 and 1173, is one of the famous courts of European history. Eleanor re-establishes the troubadour culture of her grandfather. She sponsors poets. She sponsors musicians. She commissions works. Her daughter Marie, who has been raised at the French court as Louis's eldest child, comes down to visit her mother in these years. She brings with her the learned clerk, Andreas Capellanus, who will write, from observations of this very court, the treatise on the art of loving honourably, the book that codifies the doctrines of courtly love for the medieval world. Take a moment to absorb that fact. The book that more or less invents, for the European tradition, the entire vocabulary of romantic love, the rules of courtship, the idea that love improves the lover and ennobles the soul, the framework that runs underneath every love poem of the next 8 centuries, and every romantic novel and every romantic film, was written by a clerk who was sitting in the audience, watching what the Queen of England was doing in her hall in the south of France. The whole tradition of European romantic love comes, in some real sense, out of Eleanor's afternoons at Poitiers. It is one of the more remarkable cultural origin stories in the Western tradition, and it is hers. The palace at Poitiers stands on the hill above the River Claine, inside the long oval of the old Roman walls. The Great Hall, which Eleanor herself has rebuilt during these years, is the largest secular hall in Western Europe at the time of its construction. It measures 150 feet in length. Its windows, set in the western wall, admit the long golden light of Poitevin afternoons. The ceiling is of painted beams. The floor is of pale limestone flags, polished by 7 centuries of feet to a gloss that catches reflections from the fire. The chimney-piece at the north end is carved with the arms of the Dukes of Aquitaine. The dais at the south end is the Queen's, raised 2 steps above the floor, with her chair, an oak chair with a carved back and embroidered cushions, set in its centre under a canopy of crimson silk. Picture the hall in your mind for a moment, 150 feet long, the largest secular hall in Western Europe. The setting sun coming in through the western windows in long bars of gold across the limestone floor. The Queen's chair at one end, on its dais, under its silk canopy. The fire at the other end, in the great chimney-piece, the hangings on the walls. The sound faint but constant of music being practiced somewhere in the next room. This is what she built, with the resources of her own duchy, to be the room she would receive the world in. And the world, for a few years at least, came. The daily life of the court follows the rhythm of the great meals and the services of the chapel. The day begins at first light with Mass. The Queen breakfasts with her ladies in a small private chamber. The morning is given to business. Petitioners come up from the town with requests. The chancery clerks present documents for signature. Vassals from distant counties arrive to do their homage. The Queen's seneschal settles the accounts of the household. The Queen hears reports. She dictates letters in Latin, in French, in Occitan, to her children, to the Pope, to the abbesses of her foundations, to the kings of Spain with whom she is negotiating marriages, to the commanders of her castles, and to her estranged husband, whose tone of address in her letters cools steadily through these years, from wife to consort to duchess to queen. The midday meal is the great meal. It is served in the hall. The court gathers. 3 long tables run the length of the room, with the Queen's table across their heads on the dais. The food is Aquitanian food, the food of Eleanor's childhood restored, untroubled by northern taste. There is roast venison from the forests of the Poitou. There is river fish from the Claine. There is the sharp goat cheese of the Limousin and the soft sheep cheese of the Pyrenees. There are oysters brought up in barrels of seawater from La Rochelle. There are partridges and larks and the long white pig sausages of Toulouse. There are preserved lemons from Sicily and pomegranates from Spain and the dried figs that the Queen has loved since girlhood. The bread is the fine white bread of Manchet, baked in the palace kitchens. The wine is the wine of her own vineyards, the claret of the Bordelais and the paler wine of the Cognac, served in cups of silver and, for the Queen, a cup of gold. There is something almost sensuous about reading that menu. The list of foods Eleanor restores to her own table after 30 years in the cold meat and pottage halls of the north. The figs from her childhood, the pomegranates from Spain, the lemons from Sicily, the oysters in barrels of seawater. She is, in some sense, eating her way back into her own life. After a long exile of bad cooking and worse wine, she has come home to a table that knows what she likes, and she is laying it for herself. The evening meal is smaller. It is taken in a withdrawing chamber by the Queen and her closest companions. After the meal, the troubadours come in. This is the famous half-hour of Poitiers, the hour of fin amour, when the songs are sung and the poems are recited, and the whole apparatus of the new love poetry is practiced in the presence of the woman who has made it possible. Bernard de Ventadorn sings. His songs survive in manuscripts. His most famous lyric, the Song of the Lark that rises and falls against the sun, was almost certainly written at Eleanor's court in these years. The song speaks of a lover who watches a lark rise and is filled with such envy at its joy that he wishes he might die. It is a song of almost unbearable emotional directness, and it has been set to music more than 20 times by composers of different centuries, and it is still sung in some corner of France by some performer who has found a facsimile of the manuscript almost every night of the year. I find that detail genuinely moving. A song written for a queen in a hall in the south of France in 1170, and somewhere tonight, 8.5 centuries later, someone is singing it. The hall is gone, the queen is gone, the poet is gone, the instruments they used are gone. But the song, written down by a careful hand on a scrap of parchment, and copied by another careful hand a century later into a more durable book, has survived everything. The voice in the song is still alive in some real sense. That is what poetry was for in the courts of Aquitaine. To preserve a voice in words against the loss of everything else. And it works. We are still listening. The other troubadours come and go. Pierre d'Auvergne, who is a satirist, appears with verses mocking his rivals. Rimbaud d'Orenga, who is a nobleman as well as a poet, sings of his hopeless love for a lady who may or may not be a real person. The jongleurs perform, juggling and tumbling and playing the small pipes that accompany the songs. The ladies of the court, under the Queen's eye, discuss the songs. Marie of Champagne, the Queen's daughter, presides with her mother over discussions of the proper conduct of lovers. A knight has been discourteous to his lady. What is the correct penance? A lady has given her token to one knight and then to another. How is the offence to be measured? The discussions are half serious and half play, but they codify, in their discussions, a set of expectations about courtship that over the next 100 years become the common inheritance of European aristocracy. The court holds, according to the later tradition, the courts of love themselves, in which a panel of noble ladies, presided over by Eleanor and Marie, hears cases brought by lovers and issues judgments on the proper conduct of amorous behaviour. Whether the courts of love operated as formally as the legend claims is debated. What is not debated is that the court at Poitiers was the centre of a literary and social culture that reshaped the European understanding of love, of courtship, of the relations between men and women of rank. Bernard de Ventadorn, the greatest of the surviving troubadours of the second generation, is associated with Eleanor's court and with her personally. He writes songs in which a lady, not named but described in terms that point to Eleanor, is the centre of the poet's longing. The songs survive in manuscripts, copied a century later. They have been sung continuously, in one or another form, ever since. The court at Poitiers is also, it must be said, a court of great wealth and great display. The Queen wears, for the formal receptions, gowns of Byzantine silk, in crimson and gold and dark blue. Her ladies wear similar silks, though not as fine. She has, in her treasury, the jewels that she has accumulated over a lifetime, rings and brooches and circlets, some of them gifts from Henry, others inherited from her grandfather. She has a library, a proper library, with manuscripts locked in chests, which she adds to continually through her agents in Paris and Rome and Toledo. She has a walled garden in the palace grounds, with a fountain at its centre, and orange and lemon trees grown from cuttings brought up from the Mediterranean coast. The Queen walks in it, in the late afternoons, when the shadows of the cypresses are long and the scent of the blossoms is on the air. I want you to picture her in that garden for a moment. A woman in her late 40s, in a long dark gown, walking slowly in a walled garden in the south of France, in the late afternoon, with the light on the cypresses and the smell of the orange blossoms in the air. She has been queen of 2 countries. She has crossed half the known world. She has given birth to 10 children. She has buried 2. And now, for an hour before the bells ring for vespers, she is alone in a garden of her own making. And the world, for that hour, is not pulling at her sleeve. There is something to be said for that hour. I think she knew it. Outside the palace walls, the town of Poitiers goes about its business. The stonemasons are at work on the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre, which the Queen is paying to have enlarged. The weavers of the Grand Rue make the broadcloth that is shipped down the river to La Rochelle and from there to England. The tanners of the Claine Bank, whose smell on a hot summer afternoon reaches even the high windows of the palace, supply the leather that the saddlers of the Rue Carnot work into the harnesses and boots that the court requires. The pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela stop in the town because the Cathedral of Saint-Pierre is on the pilgrimage route. The bakers, whose ovens fire before dawn, supply the bread for the palace and for the townsfolk. The poor of the town are fed 3 times a week at the palace gates on the Queen's charity, a custom she began in her first year back in Poitiers and that she continues for the rest of her life. That last detail is one I want to hold for a second. Through the imprisonment, through the long years when she had no power to enforce it, the custom continued, and the people of Poitiers came up to the gates 3 times a week, and the kitchens of the palace gave out bread and soup, because the Queen had ordered it 40 years ago, and the seneschal of the palace continued to honour it. There is, somewhere in that fact, an answer to the question of what the Queen of Aquitaine was actually like. Not the chronicler's answer, not the legend's answer, just the bread, 3 times a week at the palace gates. For decades. Eleanor raises her younger sons at Poitiers. Richard is brought up to be the Duke of Aquitaine after her. He speaks, as his first language, the Languedoc. He is tall, red-haired, athletic, musically gifted, and he will become the most famous warrior of his generation. His mother's hand is on him all his childhood. Geoffrey is raised to be Duke of Brittany. John, the youngest, is sent to Fontevraud to be educated by the nuns. The older boys, Henry the young king, and increasingly the whole household of her sons, are being prepared for the inheritance that Henry the father has been, in his usual masterful manner, promising and withholding. And here is where the great tragedy of her middle life begins. Henry II has divided the empire among his sons in name. He has crowned Henry the young king as junior king of England in 1170. He has named Richard Duke of Aquitaine. He has named Geoffrey Duke of Brittany. He has reserved John, in his own phrase, as John Lackland, with no continental possession of his own, to be provided for later. But Henry II has done something deeply characteristic and deeply provocative to all of these sons. He has named them. He has crowned them. He has invested them with the titles. And he has not, in any practical sense, given them a single foot of land to govern. The young king is King of England in name only. He has no estates. He has no court. He has an allowance from his father. He is 20 years old, and he has been crowned, and he is not allowed to do anything. Richard is Duke of Aquitaine. The duchy is governed by his mother, who governs it in her own name, not his. Geoffrey is Duke of Brittany. The duchy is governed by his father's officers. The sons are furious. They have been promised everything and given nothing. They have crowns on their heads and no kingdoms in their hands. And Eleanor, watching this from her own court at Poitiers, where she has, in fact, been governing her duchy in her own right for 5 years, sees the obvious thing. Her sons are men. They want what they have been promised, and their father is not going to give it to them. In the spring of 1173, the young king, with the encouragement of his mother and the active support of the King of France, raises a rebellion against his father. Richard joins him. Geoffrey joins him. The rebellion is launched from the French court, where Henry the young king has fled in protest, and it quickly spreads to the continental possessions of the empire. The barons of Aquitaine, of Anjou, of Normandy, who have been chafing under Henry II's heavy hand, rise to support the sons. The English barons, who have been chafing under Henry's reforms of the courts and the exchequer, rise to support the rebellion in England. The empire, in the spring of 1173, is on the verge of dissolving. Henry II, with his characteristic energy, moves to crush the rebellion. He raises an army of mercenaries from Brabant. He moves between his castles in Normandy and his castles in England with the speed that has always defined him. He defeats the young king's army at Verneuil. He defeats the Bretons at Dole. He turns to face Richard in the Aquitaine. He learns in the course of the campaign that his wife has been the principal organizer of the rebellion. Eleanor, in Poitiers, has been corresponding with the young king in Paris. She has been raising money for the cause. She has been encouraging her vassals to rise. She is, by Henry's reckoning, the queen of his enemies, and not, at this point, in any meaningful sense, his wife. I want to pause on that for a moment, because we are at the hinge of the whole story. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Queen of England, the Duchess of Aquitaine, has organized an armed rebellion against her own husband, in alliance with her 3 eldest sons, and with her former husband, the King of France. There is no precedent for this. There is no model. No queen consort of any major European kingdom has ever done such a thing. She has, in her early 50s, decided that the partnership which has structured her adult life is finished, and that she will fight on the side of her sons against their father, and that she will use her own duchy and her own resources and her own personal authority to do it. It is, in some sense, the most extraordinary political decision of the 12th century, and it is also, as it turns out, the decision that will cost her the next 16 years of her life. Henry rides south. He arrives in the Aquitaine. He sweeps Eleanor's supporters from the field. Eleanor, learning of his approach, attempts to flee from Poitiers to the safety of the French court. She rides out by night, in male disguise, with a small retinue, hoping to slip through the lines and reach Paris. She is intercepted, near Chartres, by the king's men. She is brought, under guard, to her husband. The conversation between them is not recorded. Henry sends her, the same day, to a series of fortified castles in Normandy and in England. She will not see Poitiers again for 16 years. The rebellion collapses. The sons are defeated. Each of them, in turn, makes peace with their father. Henry the young king is reconciled on humiliating terms. Richard submits. Geoffrey submits. Eleanor alone is treated as the principal author of the revolt and is placed in close confinement. She is 51. She has been queen for more than half her life. She has just made the political miscalculation that will define her last decades. And she is now, for the first time since she was 15 years old, no one's queen. She is a state prisoner. And she will be one for the next 16 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 16 years. From the age of 51 to the age of 67. The whole arc of a life that for most people contains the major work of a career, the marriage of children, the burying of parents, the meeting of grandchildren. She spends it in a series of stone chambers in English castles. She does not see her younger children grow up. She does not see her grandchildren born. She does not ride. She does not travel. She does not, for years at a time, see anyone but her own small household of attendants and the captain of her guard. She is moved every 6 months or so between Old Sarum and Winchester and Salisbury and Falaise, depending on Henry's calculation of the security risk. She is allowed to attend Mass. She is forbidden to leave the castle in which she is held without Henry's specific written permission. She is, in the technical legal language of the time, in close ward. The principal place of her imprisonment is the great royal castle at Old Sarum in Wiltshire, which is the most secure of Henry's English fortresses. The castle stands on the top of an Iron Age hill fort, on a chalk down south of the cathedral, with views in every direction over the Avon Valley. The royal apartments are in the keep, on the south side of the inner ward. Eleanor's chamber is in the upper story of the keep, with two narrow windows that look south toward the cathedral and west toward the down. The chamber is large by the standards of the period, perhaps 15 feet by 20, and is, by Henry's instruction, furnished with the necessary comforts of a royal prisoner, namely a bed, a chair, a table, a fire, a chest for her clothes, and a small private chapel. I want you to picture this chamber because it is where she lives for most of the next 16 years. A stone room on top of a chalk hill in southern England, two narrow windows, a bed, a chair, a table, a fire that has to be kept going through the long English winters because the room, even in summer, is cold, a small chapel for her private prayers, a door that is locked from the outside every night and unlocked on Henry's specific written permission only when she needs to be moved. And outside the windows, the slow English seasons turning. The chalk down going from green in spring to brown in late summer to white with snow in February. The Avon Valley misting in the morning and clearing in the afternoon. The Cathedral of Old Sarum, where she goes for mass under guard on the major feasts, standing on its own bare hill, 3/4 of a mile away across the windy down. The daily routine of the imprisonment is the routine of a religious house. She rises at dawn. She hears mass in her private chapel, said by a priest who has been vetted by Henry's chancellor. She breakfasts on bread and watered ale. She spends the morning in reading and in needlework. The midday meal is simple, served in her chamber by her own attendants. The afternoon is given to private prayer and to letters. She is allowed to write, but only to specific persons and only on specific subjects, and her letters, both incoming and outgoing, are read by the captain of the guard. The evening meal is taken in her chamber. After it, she may, with the captain's permission, walk for an hour on the battlements of the keep, where the wind comes up off the down and the sun goes down over Salisbury Plain in the long English summers. There is something I find genuinely difficult about this. We have followed her, in the course of this story, from a nursery in Poitiers, to the Cathedral of Bordeaux, to the Royal Palace in Paris, to the streets of Constantinople, to the gardens of Antioch, and back to the Great Hall at Poitiers. She has lived, by the standards of her century, an enormously expansive life. And now, suddenly, the world contracts to one chamber, two windows, a bed, a chair, a table, a door locked from the outside. The expansion of her life, all of it, has stopped. The pipe rolls of the English Exchequer, which record the routine expenses of the royal household, give us our most reliable evidence of what her imprisonment looked like in its day-to-day texture. They list the payments for her food, for the clothing of her attendants, for the candles burned in her chamber, for the wine sent down for her table. They show that her allowance was reasonably generous by the standards of state imprisonment, that she was permitted 3 personal attendants, that she was supplied with the books she requested, that her medical needs were attended to by the royal physicians when she was ill. They also show that she was, throughout the imprisonment, a state prisoner of considerable expense to the crown, and that Henry, who was famously close-fisted with the royal purse, paid for her without complaint, year after year. The reason is probably that he had not, in his heart, ever quite given up on her. He had imprisoned her, but he could not bring himself, in any of the 16 years, to repudiate her formally, to seek an annulment, to remarry, or to consign her to a convent. She remained, on paper, his queen. Hold that detail, because it is one of the strange ambiguities of the imprisonment. She is a prisoner, but she is also still the Queen of England. He has locked her up, but he has not divorced her. He has put her in a stone room with 2 windows, but he has not denied her the title or the ceremonial precedence. When the great feast days come, his chamberlain still announces, in the formal protocols of the court, that the Queen is regrettably indisposed and unable to attend, as though she were merely ill, as though the door of her chamber at Old Sarum were not, in fact, locked from the outside. There is something about the elaborate fiction of it that I find more chilling than an outright disgrace would be. The marriage is, in some sense, still being honoured, even as it is being maintained at a distance of 200 miles and an iron lock. Eleanor at 51 is not the woman she will be at 67. The first years of the imprisonment, by all the indirect evidence, are a period of considerable depression. She is allowed almost no contact with her children. The young king, her favourite, dies of dysentery in 1183 in the middle of yet another rebellion against his father at the age of 28. She is not informed for several days. When she is told by a chaplain sent from Henry's court, she retires to her chapel and is not seen by her attendants for 3 days. Her second son Geoffrey dies in a tournament in Paris in 1186 at the age of 27. Again, the news is delayed. Again, she withdraws into private grief, alone, in a stone room 200 miles from the abbey where her sons are buried. She is not allowed to attend either of their funerals. She is the Queen of England, and she is the mother of the heirs, and she is not allowed to bury her own children. I want to leave space for that, because I think it is the heaviest detail in the whole story. She buried her sons in absentia, from a chamber she could not leave, with no possibility of grieving in the way her century normally allowed, without even the small dignity of standing beside the coffin. There is a kind of cruelty in that which has nothing to do with the politics of the rebellion. It is just cruelty. And it lasted, in the case of the young king, from 1183 onward, with no possibility of retraction, for the rest of Henry's life. The years of the imprisonment are also, however, the years in which Eleanor turns inward, deepens her piety, and reads. The books in her chamber, recorded in the lists made by the captain of the guard, are mostly devotional. A Psalter, a Book of Hours, a Latin Bible, Lives of the Saints, a copy of Augustine's Confessions, which she requests in 1180 and which is delivered the following spring, a copy of the Roman poet Ovid, in particular his Metamorphoses, which she has loved since her grandfather's library at Poitiers. She reads slowly, she rereads, she memorizes whole psalms. She works at her needle on an embroidered altar cloth that she will leave to the Abbey of Fontevraud, and that will be in use, on the high altar there, for 2 centuries after her death. She also, in those years, listens. The chamber at Old Sarum has 2 windows. The southern window looks down toward the river meadows and the cathedral. The western window looks out over the down. In the spring, the larks of the down come up, hundreds of them, climbing the air in their long spiralling songs, and the queen, who has been confined to a stone room since the autumn, opens her window and listens. Bernard de Ventadorn's song, the song of the lark that rises and falls against the sun, the song that was written for her hall at Poitiers in 1170, was a song she would have remembered. There is no record that she sang it in her imprisonment. But there are records from her attendants that she listened to the larks, and that in those moments she was sometimes seen to weep. Hold that picture for a moment. An aging queen at a window of a stone, keep on a chalk down, the larks rising in the spring air, her hands resting on the stone of the window ledge. The song of the lark that her own court invented, coming back to her, 800 miles and 20 years away from the hall in which it was first sung. The wind off the down, the slow English seasons. And the woman who built the hall at Poitiers, the woman who rode to Constantinople and Antioch, the woman who organized the rebellion of her sons, listening to a small bird in a southern English sky and weeping. There is the whole imprisonment in one image. I do not think we will get closer to it than that. The years pass, 1173, 1174, 1175, 1176. The young king dies in 1183. Geoffrey dies in 1186. Eleanor's daughters, scattered across the courts of Europe by the marriages she had arranged, write to her and receive her letters back. censored and abbreviated. Her surviving sons, Richard and John, grow into men she does not see. The empire she helped to build holds, more or less, under Henry's relentless governance. Henry himself is in his 50s, then his late 50s. He continues to ride between his castles. He continues to rule. He continues, year after year, to keep her in close ward. In 1189, Henry has reached the end of his reign. Richard, his eldest surviving son, is in open revolt against him, in alliance with Philip Augustus of France. The rebellion goes badly for Henry. He is driven from castle to castle through the Loire Valley in the summer heat. He is 66 and dying. He retreats to his castle at Chinon on the Vienne, 20 miles from Fontevraud. He is told, on the 6th of July, that John, his youngest son, the son he had loved most, raised at his own court when his other sons rebelled against him, has gone over to Richard and is now in the field against him. He is reported, by the chronicler who is with him, to have turned his face to the wall and said, "It is enough. Now let everything else go as it will." He dies the next day. His body is carried to Fontevraud and buried in the Abbey Church, in the south transept, where, 15 years later, his wife will be buried beside him. Richard is now king, and his mother, after 16 years in close ward, is, on his orders, immediately released. I want you to imagine the moment of her release. She is in her chamber at Old Sarum on a July evening in 1189. She has been there, with brief moves to other castles and back, for 16 years. She is 67. The light is going down over the Avon Valley. The bells of the cathedral are ringing for vespers. And a horseman comes up the long chalk track from Salisbury at a gallop, with a sealed letter for the captain of the guard. The captain breaks the seal. He reads the letter. He does not, by the protocol of the period, come immediately to the Queen. He goes first to his own quarters, prepares himself, puts on his cleaner tunic, and then walks across the inner ward and up the keep stair and knocks at the door of her chamber. He is admitted. He bows. He says, "Madame, the king is dead. The king your son is on the throne. You are released." The chronicler does not record what she said. We can imagine, however. She has, in some real sense, been waiting for this letter for 16 years. Henry will die. Richard will be king. Richard will release her. Every morning of every year, of every cycle of seasons, she has known, in the back of her mind, that this letter was coming. Eventually, that it had only to be a matter of time. And now, here it is. The captain is standing before her with the seal of her son, the king, on a piece of folded parchment in his hand. The door of the chamber, which has been locked from the outside since the autumn of 1173, is open. The window stands open over the chalk down. The larks have gone to their nests. The light is going down. She is 67. She is free. She does not, by the chronicler's record, weep. She does not, by their record, exult. She rises from her chair, by the report of one of her attendants, and walks slowly to the window. She stands there for a long time, looking out over the down. The wind comes up. The sun goes down. The bells of the cathedral fall silent. The captain of the guard waits awkwardly in the doorway, not knowing what is required of him. Eventually she turns. She thanks him for his service through the years of her imprisonment, in a phrase that is recorded as having struck him by its formal courtesy. She asks him to make arrangements for her departure in the morning. She retires to her bed. The next day she rides out of the gate of Old Sarum, never to return. Eleanor at 67 enters the last, and in some ways the most effective phase of her political life. She rides through the shires of England during the first months of Richard's reign, appearing in the county towns, holding court, receiving the oaths of the barons, confirming charters in her son's name, ordering the release of political prisoners held by the old king. She pardons the debts owed by the poor. She moderates the forest laws. She undoes, within 6 months, a great many of the small cruelties that had accumulated in Henry's final bitter years. The chroniclers note her activity with surprise. They had not, in their memory, seen a queen mother exercise this kind of practical governance. They had forgotten, because the imprisonment had required them to forget, that Eleanor had been ruling in one form or another since she was 15. I want you to feel the shape of this. A woman of 67, who has spent the previous 16 years in stone chambers, getting back on a horse and riding through Hampshire and Wiltshire and Berkshire and Oxfordshire, holding court in market towns, releasing prisoners, pardoning debts, moderating laws. Within 6 months, at an age when most of her contemporaries were dead, with 16 years of stiff joints and indoor seasons in her body, she does it. She does it by all accounts with a competence that takes everyone by surprise. Whatever else the imprisonment had done to her, it had not, in the end, broken her capacity to govern. The room had not won. She had simply been waiting for the door to open. Richard leaves for the Mediterranean in the summer of 1190. He goes first to Sicily. He winters there. In the spring of 1191, he proceeds to Cyprus, which he conquers from a minor Byzantine prince in the course of a single campaign. Eleanor, meanwhile, has been making her own journey. She has gone, at her son's request, over the Alps to Navarre, where she has negotiated the marriage of Richard to Berengaria, the daughter of the King of Navarre. She has brought Berengaria personally by sea to Sicily. She has delivered the bride to the groom. She has turned around at Messina and ridden all the way back to Normandy, and from there to England, a journey of some 2,000 miles on horseback, in order to resume her governance. She is 69. Stop and let that number land. 2,000 miles. From Navarre, over the Pyrenees, down through Italy, by ship over the Mediterranean, to Sicily, to Cyprus, back to Sicily, north through Italy, back over the Alps, through France, over the Channel, into England. At an age when most 12th century women had been dead for decades. She did it. She did it because her son the king needed a wife, and the bride had to be fetched, and there was no one else who could be trusted with the diplomatic delicacy of fetching her. The marriage of Richard to Berengaria takes place in Cyprus in May 1191. It is childless. Berengaria is, by contemporary accounts, a pleasant and pious woman. Richard is, by the discreet murmurings of the chroniclers who lived close to his court, probably not particularly interested in women at all. The marriage is political rather than personal, and neither party appears to have expected or required more of it. Richard proceeds from Cyprus to the Holy Land. He fights at Acre. He fights at Arsuf. He negotiates with Saladin. He concludes in the autumn of 1192 a truce that recovers the coast but not Jerusalem, and he turns for home. The voyage home goes wrong. His ship is blown off course. He is forced to land on the Adriatic coast and to travel overland through Central Europe in disguise. He is recognized in an inn outside Vienna by a groom who notices the quality of his clothes. He is arrested by Leopold of Austria, who has a grudge against him from the Crusade, and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who is delighted to have such a valuable prisoner in his hands. Henry demands a ransom of 150,000 marks of silver, which is several times the entire annual revenue of the English crown. The news reaches England in the spring of 1193. Eleanor organises the ransom. She is 71. She raises the money from a realm that has been bled for the crusade already and has little left to give. She taxes every property in the kingdom at a quarter of its annual value. She takes the chalices from the churches. She takes the plate from the monasteries. She stops the building of abbeys. She stops the repair of roads. She ships the silver in barrels, under armed guard, across the Channel and up the Rhine. She travels to Germany herself with the money to conduct the final negotiations in person. She argues with the emperor. She intimidates the emperor. She secures her son's release. She brings him home by a circuitous route that avoids the territory of Philip of France, who has been trying to have Richard kidnapped or killed in transit. She delivers him to London in March 1194. He is recrowned as a precaution at Winchester. The realm is saved. The scale of the ransom is almost impossible to grasp. 150,000 marks of silver is in the coin of the realm, some 34 tons of metal. It must be weighed, tested for purity, sealed into barrels, and transported from a kingdom whose normal annual revenue cannot supply it. Eleanor raises the tax herself. She sits in the exchequer at Westminster with the accountants laid out before her. She goes through the rolls. She identifies the fortunes that can be touched and the fortunes that cannot. She levies the great abbeys of Canterbury and St. Albans and Bury St. Edmunds. She levies the earls and the barons. She levies the knights. She levies the burghers of London and of York and of Bristol. She sells the royal forests. She melts down the gold plate of the royal household. She sends her Chancellor, Hubert Walter, through the shires to pursue every penny. And she forgives no one. I want you to picture 34 tons of silver for a second. That is more than enough silver to fill 20 modern shipping containers. It is the entire monetary mass of a medium-sized economy, and it has to be raised in the period between February and December of 1193 from a single kingdom by a single old woman sitting in a hall at Westminster with a row of clerks. She does it. She does it by knowing more precisely than anyone else in England who has money and who does not, who can be pressed and who must be left alone, which monasteries have plate to spare and which are running on bread and water. The encyclopedic knowledge of her kingdom that she has been accumulating since 1154 through every royal progress and every long ride becomes, in the year of the ransom, the instrument by which her son's freedom is bought. The journey to Germany is made by Eleanor in person in the winter of 1193 and 1194. She is 71 years old. She crosses the Channel in a December storm. She rides through the Low Countries in hard frost, over roads frozen hard enough to carry the weight of the treasure wagons. She reaches Cologne. She negotiates for 3 weeks with the imperial chancellor, a clever bishop named Conrad, who raises every procedural obstacle he can think of in the hope of extracting still more money. Eleanor counters each move. She speaks, through an interpreter when necessary, and directly when not, in the Latin that is the common language of the educated West. She reminds the emperor of his obligations under the treaty already signed. She points out that the money is present, here, in barrels in her camp, and that a prompt conclusion is in the emperor's interest. She is, the imperial chroniclers later record, the most formidable negotiator that the emperor's court has ever received, and the imperial chancellor admits, after her departure, that he had been outmaneuvered at every turn. Take a moment with that picture. A woman of 71 in a winter camp on the Rhine, sitting across a trestle table from the Chancellor of the Holy Roman Empire, in Latin, for 3 weeks of nightly negotiations, with 34 tons of silver in barrels behind her in the camp, and her son, who is the King of England, in a cell in a mountain castle 200 miles to the south. And she wins. She wins not by force, because she does not have any soldiers to speak of in her camp, but by sheer political intelligence, by knowing the law better than the Chancellor, by knowing the politics better than the Emperor, by outlasting them in argument. The Empire of the Hohenstaufen, the most powerful state in Central Europe, is outmaneuvered by an old woman who has come up the Rhine in a December storm with a handful of clerks and the largest pile of silver they have ever seen. She rides home with her son in the spring of 1194. Richard is gaunt from his captivity. He has not ridden in 14 months. His health is permanently damaged by the cold, damp cells of Trifles, the mountain castle in the Palatinate, where he was held. He leans on his mother's arm, disembarking at Sandwich. She is 71. He is 36. The watching English crowd cheers, but the cheers are not entirely for the king. The chroniclers note that the crowd cries for the old queen as loudly as for the king she has brought home. For a moment on the dockside, the old woman stands with her son and acknowledges, with a slight incline of her head, the roar of a people who had not known her well, but who had come, through the year of her labour, to understand what she was. That moment, on the dockside at Sandwich, is the moment the English people met Eleanor of Aquitaine for the first time. Most of them had never seen her. And then, in the year of the ransom, they had watched a woman of 71 organise the saving of her son, tax them, bargain with them, ride to Germany in winter, bring the king home. By the time she stood on the dockside at Sandwich, they had seen what she was. The cheers came. She lived another 10 years. They did not stop coming. During Richard's captivity, his younger brother John has attempted, with encouragement from Philip of France, to seize the kingdom. John has plotted with the French. He has tried to persuade the emperor to hold Richard longer. He has raised a small rebellion in England. When Richard returns, John throws himself on his brother's mercy. Richard forgives him. Richard, whatever his other qualities, does not nurse grudges against family. His mother is less forgiving. Eleanor, who has watched one son after another betray the family into which she bore them, has developed, by her 70s, an unsentimental eye about John in particular. She understands him. She protects him, because she has to. She does not trust him. There is, in that detail, the whole of her late life. She has buried 2 sons. She has brought one home from a German cell. And she watches the last of them, John, with the patient, unillusioned eye of a woman who has seen more than most. He is her son. She will defend him to the end, but she will not pretend, even to herself, that he is what she wishes he were. That kind of clarity is rare in mothers. It is, I suspect, the particular gift of having lived long enough to see how the story actually plays out. Richard spends the last 5 years of his life fighting Philip of France to recover the territories Philip stole from the Angevin Empire during the captivity. He builds, at Les Andelys on the Seine, the Château Gaillard, a fortress that is the masterpiece of 12th century military architecture. He campaigns almost continuously. He recovers most of what was lost. And then, in the spring of 1199, in the course of the siege of a minor castle in the Limousin, a small place called Chalus-Chabrol, where a local viscount has refused to hand over a hoard of Roman gold that had been dug up in a peasant's field. Richard is wounded by an arrow. The wound becomes gangrenous. Within 10 days, he is dying. Eleanor, at Fontevraud, receives the message. She rides south at once. She covers the distance from the Loire to the Limousin in 3 days, a pace that young men in their prime would find exhausting at the age of 77. She reaches her son's tent before he dies. She is with him, along with his wife Berengaria, when the end comes on the 6th of April, 1199. He forgives the crossbowman who shot him. He names his brother John as his successor. He dies in his mother's arms. I want to leave space for that detail, because it is, after 65 years of her public life, one of the simplest and saddest things in the whole story. The greatest warrior of his generation, the crusader of crusaders, the lion of the chronicles, the boy she had raised in the Languedoc and watched grow into a man taller than his father, killed by a stray arrow at the siege of a third-rate castle over a peasant's hoard of buried gold. He dies in her arms. She is 77. She has buried, by the end of that day, 3 of her own sons. His body is carried to Fontevraud. It is laid in a tomb beside his father. The dispute over the succession, which had haunted Henry's last years, comes now to the surface. The Angevin lands in France prefer the claim of Arthur of Brittany, the son of the dead Geoffrey, a boy of 12 who has been raised at the French court under the tutelage of Philip Augustus. The English barons prefer John. Eleanor, who has her own reasons to distrust Arthur, supports John without hesitation. She rides through Aquitaine. She holds Anjou for John. She meets John at Rouen and arranges his coronation as Duke of Normandy. She prevents for the moment the collapse of the Angevin Empire into the hands of Philip. John is crowned King of England at Westminster on the 27th of May, 1199. He is 32. He has inherited a realm too large to govern with his abilities, a treasury depleted by Richard's wars and ransom, and a continental opponent in Philip, who is now the greatest strategist of his generation. Eleanor, who has given him the crown, understands what she has done. She believes, rightly, that John is the best available choice. She does not believe he will be a good king. She is correct on both counts. For the next 3 years, Eleanor, now approaching 80, does what she can. She rides through the Aquitaine. She receives the homage of barons, who would have given their loyalty to Arthur. She visits the abbeys of her country. She takes up residence at Poitiers and at Bordeaux in turn, holding her own court, acting as a kind of walking assurance of legitimacy for John. She travels to Castile in the year 1200, in the winter, over the Pyrenees, to bring back her granddaughter Blanche, the child of her daughter Eleanor of Castile, who has been chosen as the bride of Louis VIII of France. The journey is arduous, beyond what could reasonably have been asked of a woman of 77. She makes it without complaint. She delivers Blanche into the keeping of the French. Blanche will become, through this journey, the mother of Saint Louis and one of the most influential queens of France in her own right. The line of Aquitaine, through Eleanor's calm, patient, relentless dynastic labour, is knit into every royal house of the West. The journey to Castile is worth describing in more detail, because it is the kind of journey that old age does not ordinarily undertake. Eleanor leaves Poitiers in January of 1200. She rides south through the Poitou and the Gascony, sleeping in the abbeys and the castles of her own vassals along the old pilgrim road. She reaches the Pyrenees in February. She crosses the mountains through the pass of Roncesvalles, the pass through which the pilgrims go down into Spain, and which in February is treacherous with snow and ice and with the thin wind that comes off the peaks. She is carried, for the steepest sections, in a litter slung between 2 mules. She stays in the mountain hostelries kept by the monks of Cluny, whose job it is to receive pilgrims in all weathers. She comes down into Navarre. She continues south through the high plateau of Castile to the royal court at Burgos. Her daughter Eleanor, who has been Queen of Castile for 30 years and has 11 children of her own, receives her mother with the grown affection of a woman who has not seen her mother since she was a child of 20, sent south over these same mountains as a bride. There is something almost unbearable about that reunion. A daughter, a Queen of Castile in her own right, with 11 children, meeting her mother for the first time as an adult. Both of them in their grown lives. Both of them women who have outlived most of the people who shaped them. Sit with it for a moment. There must have been a long evening in the royal apartments at Burgos in the spring of 1200, when the two of them sat together by a fire and tried, slowly, to fill in the 30 years that had passed without each other. We have no record of what was said. We have only the fact of the journey and the fact that it was made. And in the absence of any other evidence, the journey itself is the answer. She went, at 77, in winter, over the Pyrenees, because there was a daughter in Burgos she had not seen since the daughter was 20. That is its own form of love. It does not need to be described in words. They spend the spring together at Burgos. Eleanor inspects the royal grandchildren. There are 3 daughters of marriageable age. The political instructions from the French court specify that Blanche, the second daughter, is the intended bride. Eleanor, who is 80 and has seen a great deal, disagrees. She believes the elder daughter, who is called Urraca, would be a poorer fit for Paris, both in temperament and in the acoustic difficulty the French courtiers will have with her name. She selects Blanche instead, on the authority of her own judgment, and the French court, when the bride is delivered, finds Eleanor's choice correct. Blanche, rechristened as Blanche of Castile, will be the mother of Saint Louis and the regent of France during his minority, and, in her turn, one of the formidable queens of the 13th century. Eleanor's eye for dynastic material, honed over 60 years, has chosen well one final time. She recrosses the Pyrenees in the late spring, with her granddaughter in her company. She rides north through Gascony in the early summer. She reaches Bordeaux in June. She stays there for the hot weeks of the summer, in her own palace, in the city in which she was married at the age of 15. She has not seen Bordeaux since she was a young queen. It smells, on the summer evenings, of the river and of the ripening vineyards, and of the stone of the old cathedral where her wedding took place. She delivers Blanche to the French envoys at Tarascon in May. She returns north to Fontevraud in the autumn. She has been away from her country for nearly a year. She has, in that year, secured the dynastic future of France through her own judgment, in her own person, with the authority of a reputation that no younger queen could possibly have carried. In the summer of 1202, at the age of 80, Eleanor makes the last of her great rides. A rebellion has broken out in the Aquitaine in favour of Arthur of Brittany. Arthur, now 15, has the backing of Philip and of a faction of Poitevin barons. He marches on Poitiers. Eleanor, who is at Fontevraud, rides to Mirabeau, a castle between Fontevraud and Poitiers, to hold it until John can come to her relief. Arthur arrives at Mirabeau with his forces. He besieges her in the keep. He sends her a message demanding her surrender and offering her safe conduct to Fontevraud. She refuses. She sends a messenger out of a postern gate with a plea to John for help. John, who has been in Normandy, marches south at a speed that astonishes everyone. He covers 80 miles in 48 hours. He falls on Arthur's camp at dawn. The besiegers are taken in their sleep. Arthur is captured. Eleanor is rescued. It is, in a terrible final irony, the most competent military operation of John's career, and he conducts it to save his mother. 80 miles in 48 hours, through the hill country of western France in midsummer, with a body of mounted knights and their squires and their pack horses, to save his 80-year-old mother from her 15-year-old grandnephew. There is a strange poetry in that. The unloved son riding all night through July to save the mother who never quite trusted him. Arriving at dawn at the right moment, succeeding, the one time in his life, by speed and resolution. He never managed it again, but he managed it that once, and the woman he saved was Eleanor. Arthur of Brittany is carried off to a castle in Normandy. He disappears from history within the year. What happened to him has never been conclusively established, though the probability is that he was murdered on John's orders, possibly by John in person. The murder of Arthur will accelerate the collapse of the Angevin continental empire. The Poitevin barons, having seen what John is prepared to do to a nephew, will conclude that they have no future under such a king. Philip will seize the opportunity. By 1204, Normandy will be French. The empire that Eleanor helped to build in 1152 will be broken by her own son in 1204, 52 years later. I want to leave space for that. The empire she had helped to build in 1152, on the day of her wedding to Henry, on the chamber where her grandfather had died, was going to be undone, in 1204, by her own son, under the pressure of his own crimes, in the year in which she herself died. There is a kind of structural rhyme in her life, an opening and a closing in the same year, and she lived long enough to see it. Most of us are spared the symmetry. She was not. Eleanor, after the relief of Mirabeau, does not ride again. The effort of Mirabeau appears to have exhausted her. She is 80. She retires, definitively, to Fontevraud. She takes the veil, not as a vow, but as a retreat, a withdrawal from the public life of which she has been a principal actor for 65 years. She lives, in her last 2 years, in the abbey guest quarters. She hears Mass. She walks in the cloister. She continues to dictate letters on political matters when the situation requires. She receives visitors. She is attended by the nuns of the abbey and by a small personal household of her own. I want to slow down here because we are approaching the end of her life, and the chamber we glimpsed at the very beginning of our story tonight, the room with the brazier and the scribe and the chanting from the abbey church, is the chamber she is settling into now. The frame closes. The 82 years she will live are condensing into the small daily round of an old woman in a quiet abbey by a quiet river. And there is, before we get to the end itself, a great deal worth noticing about the place where she is choosing to spend it. Fontevraud is, in the early 13th century, the most important religious house in western France. It is a double monastery with both monks and nuns, governed by an abbess, which is the unusual arrangement that the founder Robert of Arbrissel had insisted upon a century earlier. The abbey church is large, vaulted, built of the pale local limestone that will still be pale and clean 8 centuries later when modern visitors walk through it. The cloister is open to the sky. The kitchen is a separate building, octagonal, with a series of chimneys that survive as one of the architectural curiosities of French Romanesque. The gardens run down to the valley. The country around is gentle and wooded and full of the smell of the river. I want you to notice that detail of the governance, because it is not incidental. Fontevraud is governed by an abbess. Both the men and the women of the house answer to a woman. This was Robert of Arbrissel's specific arrangement when he founded the place 100 years before Eleanor settled into it, and it was unusual enough in its century to have caused a small scandal at the time. By the early 13th century, the arrangement had been operating long enough that no one questioned it anymore. But it was still, and is still, a remarkable thing about the place. Eleanor, in her last 2 years, was living in a community in which a woman ruled, in which the formal authority of the abbey rested on the shoulders of a woman, in which the men of the house took her commands. After 80 years of being a woman in a man's world, she chose, for her ending, to live in a place where it was the other way round. I do not think that was an accident. The abbey's daily life, which Eleanor observes without quite participating in, follows the ancient round of the Benedictine hours. Matins is sung at 2 in the morning, in the deep winter darkness, the sisters filing into the choir with lanterns to read the antiphons. Lauds follows at dawn. Prime comes at 6, terce at 9, sext at midday, none at 3, vespers at sunset, compline as the last office before sleep. The hours divide the day into the patient octaves by which the religious life has been lived in Europe for 6 centuries by the time Eleanor arrives at Fontevraud. She is not required to attend every office, but she does attend Mass each morning and Vespers each evening. She sits in a small carved stall that has been reserved for her in the south transept, close to the tombs of her husband and her son. Her voice, in the responses, is thinner than it used to be, but still clear. The nuns, watching her sidelong over the edges of their own stalls, remark afterwards to one another that the old queen knows every psalm by heart and will answer the antiphons in Latin without looking at her book. Of course she does. She has been hearing those psalms sung in those exact rhythms for 8 decades. The chants she heard in the Cathedral of Poitiers when she was a child are the chants she is hearing now. They have not changed. The bone of medieval Christianity, the daily liturgy, was so stable that a woman could grow old and not have to learn a single new word of the office. Whatever else has been taken from her over the years, the psalms have not changed. There is a strange comfort in that. She closes her eyes in the south transept on a winter morning, and the responses come out of her without effort. The way a song you learned at 5 comes out without effort, because you have been singing it all your life. I told you, hours ago in this story, that a song learned in childhood is a song that does not leave. Here, in the small carved stall in the south transept of Fontevraud, is the proof. The food of the abbey is the food of a moderately wealthy religious house in the early 13th century. The sisters eat twice a day in the refectory, their meals taken in silence, while a lector reads from the lives of the saints. Fish from the Vienne appears on the table on fast days, which are most days of the ecclesiastical calendar. On feast days there is meat, usually poultry, sometimes mutton. The bread is the good wheat bread of the Loire, the wine is watered, the cheeses are local, the herbs are from the abbey garden. Eleanor, in her guest quarters, eats the same food that the sisters eat, except that a little better wine is served to her by her own household and a little more meat, on the advice of the abbey physician, who is concerned about her strength in the winter months. It is simple. She has made, in her bequests, arrangements for candles to be burned at her tomb in perpetuity, for masses to be said for her soul, for psalms to be sung for her husband Henry, and for her son Richard, who lie already in the abbey church. She has arranged for the tombs themselves. She has commissioned, she has overseen, the effigies that will be carved to mark where she and Henry and Richard are buried. Her own effigy, which is being worked on in the stonemason's shed attached to the abbey, shows her as she wishes to be remembered, not as a queen in state, not as a young bride, as an old woman crowned, lying in repose with an open book in her hands. The book in the effigy is significant. Effigies of queens in the 12th century, when they exist at all, show the queen with her hands folded in prayer or holding a scepter. Eleanor's effigy shows her reading. She is reading, specifically, what appears in the carving to be a psalter or a book of hours, the kind of personal devotional book that a noblewoman of her period would have owned. But the detail is striking and unprecedented. The Queen of England, the Queen of France, the Duchess of Aquitaine, is shown for eternity with her eyes lowered to a book. She has asked in stone to be remembered, not as a ruler, but as a reader. The choice is not accidental. Hold that detail for a moment. It is one of the most quietly extraordinary acts of self-definition in the whole medieval record. She had been, in her life, a duchess of one of the great duchies of Europe, a queen consort of two of its great kingdoms, the mother of two crowned kings, the leader of a rebellion, the prisoner of a king, the saviour of an empire, the negotiator of an emperor. By any measure, she could have asked the sculptor to show her in any of those roles. She could have been shown enthroned, or holding a scepter, or in armour on horseback, or surrounded by her sons. Instead, at 82, with her tomb being prepared, she said to the sculptor, "Show me reading. Show me with my eyes lowered to a book." The book, the small private book of devotions and possibly of poetry, was the thing she wanted carved into the stone for the next 800 years. The reader was the thing she chose. In the late winter of 1204, Eleanor is 82 and failing. The news from the north is bad. Rouen has fallen to Philip in June of 1204. Normandy is gone, the duchy that her husband inherited from his mother and that he conquered for his wife and his sons, is now a province of France. The Angevin Empire, in the east, is effectively finished. John holds Aquitaine still, through her, but without her he will not hold it long. She writes through the winter to her grandson Otto of Brunswick, the Holy Roman Emperor, who is her daughter Matilda's son, asking for his diplomatic support. She writes to her granddaughter Blanche in Paris. She writes to the Abbess of Fontevraud about the dispositions for her funeral. She has become, in the last months of her life, the writer of letters that settle accounts. Her appetite, in the last weeks, diminishes. She asks for the foods of her childhood, for figs and almonds, for the sharp white cheese of the Poitou, for the thin red wine of her own vineyards. The abbey kitchen supplies what it can. Her sleep, which has been light for years, becomes lighter. She wakes in the small hours and lies listening to the silence of the abbey and, through the silence, to the tiny sounds of the night. The mice in the wainscot, the owl in the apple orchard, beyond the walls, the wind in the poplars, along the Vienne. She thinks of her mother, whom she cannot remember clearly. She thinks of her grandfather, the troubadour, whose songs she still hears in her head in his own voice, though he has been dead for 87 years. She thinks of Louis, who was never cruel to her, only dull. She thinks of Henry, which is more complicated. She thinks of Richard. She thinks of her daughters, most of whom have predeceased her. She thinks, through the long watches of the hours before Lords, of the 12,000 nights she has slept, and the 12,000 mornings she has risen, and the length of it astonishes her. 12,000 nights. 12,000 mornings. Run that calculation in your own head for a moment. 82 years is roughly 30,000 days. Eleanor, lying awake in the small hours, calculates that she has slept 12,000 nights and risen 12,000 mornings, and she finds that the length of it astonishes her. It will astonish you too if you sit with it long enough. We do not, most of us, count our days. We do not, most of us, lie awake in our 80th year and look back over the whole accumulated stretch of mornings and nights. Eleanor, for whatever reason, did. And the chronicler who recorded it, or possibly invented it, on the basis of what a woman of her age would naturally have thought, has given us one of the rare passages in medieval literature in which an old person simply reckons up the weight of her own life and finds it large. She is visited, sometime in the March or April of that year, by her son John, who comes to Fontevraud to see her. The meeting is not recorded in detail. What they said to each other, after everything, is not known. He stays for a day or two, and then leaves. He will lose the rest of the Angevin Empire within 2 years. He will lose the support of the English barons within 10. He will sign Magna Carta under duress at Runnymede on the 15th of June, 1215. He will die of dysentery, in flight from his own kingdom, in October of 1216. None of this, in April of 1204, is certain. All of it, in April of 1204, is already prefigured. And Eleanor, watching him ride away down the valley of the Vienne for the last time, probably knows it. I find that one of the saddest images in the whole story. An old woman in an abbey window, watching her last surviving son ride away down a road, knowing that he will lose, after she is gone, almost everything she helped to build, knowing, too, that she has done what she could for him, that she has gotten him a crown, that she has kept him on it through Mirabeau, that she has held the Aquitaine for him across the early years of his reign, knowing also that the limits of what one mother can do for one inadequate son have, in his case, been reached. There is a kind of weary, clear-eyed love in the gaze with which she watches him go. It is not the love that fixes everything. It is the love that does what it can and accepts that it cannot do more. Most of us, I think, end up with that kind of love eventually. Eleanor got there a little earlier than most. The spring comes to Fontevraud. The lime trees along the abbey walls put out their first leaves. The nightingales return to the woods along the river. The sisters plant the herb garden. The fields beyond the abbey walls turn green. Eleanor, in her chamber, is given the last rites by the chaplain. She receives them in full possession of her faculties. She asks to be carried to the window so that she can see the garden. She is carried, she looks out, she dictates, the sources vaguely state, a final letter, possibly to John, possibly to no one in particular. She is put back to bed. She dies on the 1st of April, 1204, in the late afternoon, in the abbey guest quarters at Fontevraud. Her death is peaceful. The chroniclers, most of whom have opposed her, called her worldly and proud and dangerous, set down her obituary with a respect that borders on grief. She has been part of the world they lived in for so long that her absence from it seems unimaginable. The greatest chronicler of her generation, Richard of Devizes, who did not like her, writes that she was a woman without equal, and that with her passing in age has closed. Sit with that final phrase for a moment. It comes from a man who disapproved of her, from a man who had spent his career writing about her in carefully cool tones, suggesting, more often than not, that her influence on the politics of his time had been a problematic one. And yet, when she dies, when the news reaches him in his cell and he sits down to write the obituary, what comes out of him is not a critique. It is the recognition that she had been, for as long as he had been alive, one of the great fixed points of his world. With her gone, the world has changed. He cannot quite, in his own writing, find the words for it. But he writes, in the end, the line that any of us would settle for. A woman without equal, an age has closed. Her body is laid out in the Abbey church. She is dressed, by her own instructions, in the robes of her coronation as Queen of England, which she has kept in a chest for 50 years. A crown is placed on her head. A sceptre is placed in her hand. She is laid beside the effigy that has already been prepared for her, which the stonemasons, with tender haste, put into position while her body lies in state. She is buried in the south transept of the Abbey, between her husband Henry and her son Richard, the two men in whose lives she had the most concentrated influence and from whom she had suffered the most complicated pain. The funeral is attended by bishops, by abbesses, by the nuns of the Abbey in their black robes, by the few remaining Aquitanian vassals who have ridden up the valley to mourn her. There are no kings present. The King of France is engaged in the dismantling of her empire. The King of England is her son, who cannot come. There are no kings present. I want you to feel the quietness of that. The funeral of the woman who had been, in her century, the most powerful queen in Europe was attended by no kings at all. By bishops, by abbesses, by nuns in black, by old vassals from the Aquitaine. The chant from the choir went up. The candles were lit on the altar. The body was carried in. The mass was said. The body was laid into its tomb. And no king came. Some lives end with horns and trumpets. Hers ended with a chant of nuns in a small abbey in the valley of the Vienne. And in the long view of history, I think the second is the finer of the two. The tombs in the south transept of Fontevraud are among the masterpieces of medieval sculpture. They are painted, in their original state, in vivid colours that have largely faded, leaving the pale stone to stand as it now stands. Henry II lies in the crown of a king, holding a sceptre. Richard I lies beside him, also crowned, also holding a sceptre, his face set in the slight smile that the sculptor apparently thought appropriate to a man who had died as a warrior. Beside Richard, a century later, Isabella of Angoulême, the second wife of John, was buried. Across from Richard lies Eleanor. Her effigy, as she requested, shows her with her book open in her hands. Her eyes, carved in stone, are not closed but lowered, as if she is reading. She wears the coronation crown. She wears the mantle of a queen. The book is held at the level of her chest, its pages visible, its stone pages inscribed with nothing. That is one of the details that sticks with me. The sculptor put her with a book in her hands, but he did not put any letters on the pages. The book is open, but it is open to a blank. Whether that was the sculptor's choice, or whether the letters were once painted on the surface and have weathered away, is not entirely certain. Either way, the effect now, 800 years later, is of a queen reading a page on which any of us could write what we needed to. The book is the symbol of her literacy and her seriousness and her interior life. The blank pages are the place where the people who come and look at her can put whatever they have brought with them. It is, I think, the perfect tomb for a woman whose life cannot quite be summed up. The four effigies at Fontevraud survived the wars of religion, which wrecked so much of French ecclesiastical art in the 16th century. They survived the Revolution, which dismantled the abbey as a functioning religious house in 1792 and turned the buildings into, successively, a prison, a school, and in the 20th century, a museum. The tombs were moved, at various points, and restored. They are now displayed in the south transept more or less where they were originally placed, though the bodies themselves were disturbed during the Revolution and can no longer be located with certainty. What remains in the stone of the effigies is the face Eleanor chose for the centuries to see. The face is old. The sculptor has not flattered her. The cheeks are sunken. The eyelids are heavy. The mouth is firm and slightly pinched. She is not the young bride who rode up from Bordeaux in 1137 with 500 Poitevin knights at her back. She is not the Crusader queen who rode east in 1147. She is the woman who returned from Antioch, who was imprisoned at Old Sarum, who was released at 67, who raised the ransom for her son. The woman who rode to Navarre and across the Alps and to Castile and home, who saved the empire in 1199 and watched it begin to fall in 1202 and lived long enough to see Rouen fall in 1204. She has come, in the stone, to the end. I want you to picture her there now. A woman of stone, lying on her back, in a transept of pale limestone, with a slight smile on the face of her son to her right, and the heavier face of her husband to her right beyond him. The light in Fontevraud, in the late afternoon, comes through the high windows of the transept in long bars. It moves across the stones over the course of an hour. It catches the open book in her stone hands. It lights the face. It moves on. Tourists come and go. Children whisper to their parents. The stones are 800 years old. The woman has been dead for 800 years. The book in her hands is still open. The pages are still blank. The light still comes through the windows in the late afternoon. Some things, once made, last. The line that Eleanor knit into the royal houses of Europe, through her 8 children and through the marriages she arranged for them and for her grandchildren, is one of the most consequential dynastic networks in the history of the West. Her descendants ruled by direct line of succession in England, in France, in Castile, in Sicily, in the Holy Roman Empire, and in nearly every minor royal and princely house of the continent. Saint Louis of France was her grandson, through Blanche of Castile. Otto IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, was her grandson through Matilda. The kings of Aragon and the kings of Navarre traced their descent from her. The Habsburg line, in time, would carry her blood. There is hardly a royal house of medieval and early modern Europe that does not, somewhere in its genealogy, point back to Aquitaine and to the woman who brought it into the political centre of the Western world. Run your eye over that for a moment. Saint Louis of France, the most famous king of the Capetian line, the monarch who would lead the Seventh Crusade and be canonized after his death, was her grandson. Otto IV, who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1209, was her grandson. The kings of Aragon, of Navarre, of Castile, of Sicily were her descendants. The English kings down through the centuries, and through them, the British monarchy of our own day, descend from her. The royal houses of Europe, branching and rebranching across 8 centuries, run, more often than not, somewhere in their lines, back to a small girl in a Poitiers nursery in 1122 who was named Other Eleanor because her parents wanted to keep the name straight in the parish register. There is a quiet astonishment in that, when you sit with it long enough. The most influential queen of her century turned out also to be one of the most influential ancestors of every century that followed. The footnote of her birth has become the headline of half the genealogies of Europe. Now, before we close, I want to do one thing that I think she would have wanted. I want to clear away some of the legends. Because here is the strange afterlife of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The actual woman, with all the genuinely extraordinary things she actually did, has been so thoroughly buried under 3 centuries of lurid storytelling that most of what people now think they know about her is invention. The poison in the maze, the topless ride to Jerusalem, the affair with Saladin, none of these is in any contemporary chronicle. All of them are inventions, in some cases medieval, in some cases later, that grew up in the absence of any clear sense of who she actually was, and that have been kept alive because they make better stories than the truth. Take the poisoning of Rosamund Clifford. The story, in its developed form, has Eleanor finding Rosamund in the maze at Woodstock and offering her a choice between a dagger and a cup of poison. Rosamund chooses the cup. Eleanor watches her drink. The story is vivid. The story is also entirely without basis. Rosamund Clifford did die young, sometime in the 1170s, but she died of natural causes at the convent of Godstow, where Henry had placed her after their relationship cooled. Eleanor was in Old Sarum at the time, under guard, and could not have come within 100 miles of her. The poisoning story first appears in a popular ballad in the 14th century, 200 years after both women were dead, and it tells us only what the ballad writers of the late Middle Ages thought a queen of jealous temper would do. It does not tell us anything about Eleanor. Take the topless crusader. The story, which has appeared in every popular history of Eleanor for 200 years, has her riding into Jerusalem, or at one point Constantinople, dressed as an Amazon, with one breast bare. The story has no foundation in any contemporary account. The Greek and Latin chroniclers, who saw her in Constantinople and Jerusalem, describe her dress, sometimes in considerable detail, as that of a noblewoman of her rank. The Amazon detail appears nowhere. It seems to have been invented by an 18th century French novelist and to have spread from there into the popular tradition. It tells us about 18th century notions of medieval women. It does not tell us about Eleanor Peckhai. 8. Take the affair with Saladin. This one is almost touching in its absurdity. The chronology is impossible. The story is impossible. It nevertheless appeared, in various forms, from the late Middle Ages onward, and it has been repeated in works of popular history into the 20th century. It tells us, mostly, about the inability of a certain kind of imagination to leave an interesting woman alone. I find it genuinely sad, looking at the legends, that they had to be invented at all. The actual Eleanor was so much more interesting than any of them. The woman who rode east at 25 with 300 of her own knights. The woman who proposed marriage by messenger to a man 11 years her junior. The woman who held an empire together while her husband rode. The woman who survived 16 years of imprisonment without losing her mind, came out at 67 and ran her son's regency with a competence that left the chroniclers gaping. The woman who rode to Navarre at 69, to Germany at 71, to Castile at 77, and to Mirabeau at 80. The woman who chose, for her tomb, to be carved with a book in her hands. That is the actual Eleanor. She does not need the poison in the maze. She does not need the bared breast on the crusade. She does not need an impossible affair with a child general. The truth of her was already, in its plainness, larger than the legends. The most famous modern depiction of Eleanor is in a play, and later a film, called The Lion in Winter. The film, made in 1968, with Katharine Hepburn as Eleanor and Peter O'Toole as Henry, is set during the Christmas court of 1183, when the family conflicts that had defined Eleanor's middle years were coming to their bitter peak. The film is, by any reasonable measure, a masterpiece. Hepburn's Eleanor is one of the great performances in 20th century cinema, and the role won her an Oscar. The film captures something true about the corrosive intimacy of the Plantagenet family at war with itself. What it does not capture, because no 2-hour film could, is the 80-year arc of which the Christmas court of 1183 is one short scene. It does not show the ride east to Antioch. It does not show the night flight in male disguise. It does not show the 16 years of imprisonment, or the release at 67, or the regency, or the ransom journey, or Mirabeau, or the death at Fontevraud. It shows a single Christmas. The actual life was 82 years long. I mention this only because, around Christmas every year, on television channels around the world, The Lion in Winter shows up in the schedules, and people who have never heard of Eleanor of Aquitaine watch Katharine Hepburn play her. They come away knowing one thing about her, that she was a woman of great force, married to in a family of great forces, in some long ago December. That is true, as far as it goes, but it is one Christmas of 82. And the 82 is, in the end, the story. And so, at the close of this very long evening, we come back to where we began. The chamber at Fontevraud, the brazier, the candle, the scribe, the chanting from the abbey church beyond the wall. She has dictated her last letters. The light has gone from the window. The bells have rung for Compline, the last office of the day. The sisters have filed back into the choir for the last time before sleep. The chant rises, very faint now, through the stone. It is the chant of the Nunc Dimittis, the Canticle of Simeon. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. The same chant Eleanor heard at Compiègne as a child in Poitiers, as a young queen at Saint-Denis, as the Queen of England at Westminster, as a prisoner in the chapel of Old Sarum, and now as an old woman at the Abbey of Fontevraud, lying in the bed where she will die. She has lived through 3 kings of France, 3 kings of England, and 4 popes. She has crossed the Channel more than 15 times. She has ridden the length of her empire and across the Pyrenees twice. She has buried 5 of her 8 children. She has built a chamber with her own taste in a palace where her grandfather died. She has commissioned a tomb on which she will be shown reading. She has loved, in her own complicated way, the men she has been married to and the children she has borne, and she has been loved back, in their own complicated ways, in return. She has not been a saint. She has been, for 82 years, a person who acted, a person who chose, a person who, when she had no choices, found smaller choices inside the larger absences, a person who stayed, herself, through every transformation of her circumstances. The girl in the Poitiers nursery who learned her letters at 5 is still, on the bed at Fontevraud, at 82, the same person, with the same letters, just older and tireder, and at last ready to lie down. The candle gutters. The scribe gathers his parchment. The brazier glows down to embers. The chant from the abbey church reaches its long final note and stops. The silence afterwards, the silence of a 1,000-year abbey on the 1st of April, 1204, is the silence into which her breathing slows and stops. She is gone. The empire she built will fall. Her son will lose Normandy within months. Her grandson will be the great St. Louis. Her descendants will sit on every throne in Europe. Her tomb will be defaced and restored and defaced and restored across 8 centuries, and the book in her stone hands will go on being held open, with its blank pages, for whoever comes to look. She is not the legends. She is, more than any of these, the woman in the chamber at Fontevraud, who chose, when she could finally choose anything she wanted, to be remembered with a book in her hands. That is what I want to leave with you tonight. Not the conqueror, not the rebel, not the prisoner, the reader. The person who, after 82 years of doing more than almost any other woman of her century did, asked the sculptor for a book. Thank you for spending this evening with me, walking the long road of her life. From the nursery in Poitiers, to the wedding in Bordeaux, to the cold court at Paris, east to Constantinople and Antioch, north to London and Westminster, back to the great hall at Poitiers and the troubadours and the fountain in the walled garden, to the prison at Old Sarum, to Germany in winter with 34 tons of silver, to Castile over the Pyrenees in the snow, to Mirabeau, and at last to the chamber at Fontevraud, where the bells were ringing for Compiègne and the light was going down over the valley of the Vienne. If you have stayed with me through all of it, I am very grateful. I hope the road has been a gentle one for you, and that wherever you are listening from, the room around you is quiet now and the night is settling in. If any part of her story stayed with you, the chamber she was born in, the dome of Hagia Sophia, the lark song in Bernard de Ventadorn, the night ride in male disguise, the moment of release at 67, the death of Richard in her arms, the 80-mile ride of John to save her at Mirabeau, the book in the stone hands of the effigy, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. This story was built on her courage and on your willingness to come along. There is another story coming, a different country, a different century, a different kind of life that is worth following slowly through a long evening. And I think if you are still here at the end of all of this, you are exactly the kind of person who will want to know it. If you have not yet subscribed, please do, so the next story finds you when it is ready. If you found this useful, please share it with someone you think would want to walk a long road with with a quiet voice for a few hours. And for now, sleep well. Good night.